And that was how everything ended. The hero Evan apologized to everyone. He acknowledged that he wasn't strong enough. He believed that the real hero should have been Chris, not him. But at that moment, the mage approached and tried to comfort him, saying that everyone had done their best. However, Evan disagreed. He insisted that Chris was much more skilled, a true sword genius, someone who could have prevented the end. That was when the story of Chris the Extra began to unfold. Thanks to his extraordinary abilities, he was able to learn anything almost instantly. He was someone with rare talent who built a grand legacy throughout his life. It all began when he was 20 years old, right after escaping from his clan, which he considered cursed. At that time, he dreamed of achieving success, even if he had to work in dark and dangerous alleys. But then, the Magic Empire was invaded by the Demon King's forces, and as expected, people began to be recruited to form the hero's party. Chris didn't miss this opportunity. He saw it as a journey toward glory, victory, and destiny. However, in the end, everything went wrong. The Domain of Light fell into the hands of the Demon King of Carnage, and all efforts were in vain. Meanwhile, Evan remained convinced that Chris should have been the true hero. But Chris, in turn, thought that being a hero was not a desirable fate. Even if he had the chance to go back in time, he wouldn't do it all over again. For him, a life full of suffering was more than enough. There was no point in daydreaming. What happened, happened, and soon the world would come to an end. He only wished that, if there were a next life, he could be born as the son of a wealthy family and live in comfort. What Chris didn't expect was for that wish to actually come true. He was reborn. He returned to life in the body of a young master of the Magic Empire, a member of the Dark Magic Clan, one of the 12 clans that uphold the structure of the Empire. He was astonished to realize that he had gone back 15 years into the past, before the end of the world. More precisely, 5 years after the beginning of what would later be known as the Era of Destruction. Despite all that he had experienced in his previous life, he never imagined seeing demons tending to gardens. The most surprising thing was that he now inhabited the body of Christian Van Baron Kazar, a name that brought back bad memories. When he heard that name in his past life, he immediately remembered that the Van in the middle indicated that Christian was not from the main family. House Kazar, led by the Count, had several affiliated families, and the Dark Magic Clan was one of them. Contrary to what Chris had imagined, it was not a weak family. On the contrary, they were powerful, wealthy, and respected throughout the Empire. In that household, there were two possible successors. The eldest was Christian, the problematic and despicable boy who always caused trouble. Eventually, Count Kazar himself gave up on him. But that was in the past, as Christian ended up being assassinated by members of his own family. When Chris realized he was in the body of that cursed boy, he wondered why that had happened. Why did he have to reincarnate as someone hated and doomed to die? 3 days earlier, he had awakened in that body. Coincidentally, the new name was very similar to the one he had in his previous life. But there was a problem. Christian was going to die in a few years, eliminated by his own family. That was because the Kazar family valued honor above all else. And Christian was seen as a disgrace, someone who stained the family name. Then Chris realized that if he could keep quiet and not cause trouble, maybe he could survive. Despite the risk, he was now a rich child, just as he had wished. However, he couldn't simply enjoy this new life. He knew the end of the world was coming. Ragnarok, the apocalypse, would happen soon. The Demon King of Carnage had initiated the war with the aim of sacrificing all of humanity. And even though it was still early, it was almost impossible to stop it. Soon, the Magic Empire, the Domain of Light, and everything else would fall. If he wanted to survive and enjoy the rich life he had gained, he would have to prevent the apocalypse. The most important step would be to defeat the Demon King of Carnage, since he was the true cause of the war. But to do that, Chris would need to become even more powerful. In the end, there was only one path. He had to become the Demon King, the true sovereign of the Empire of Magic. There were still 5 years before the start of the Era of Destruction, and perhaps with a good plan he could change everything. Maybe, with effort and strategy, everything could become his. But his plans were interrupted when he left his room. His father immediately confronted him sternly. He said he had made it clear that he was not to leave the room. He declared that showing his shameless face in public would only bring more trouble, and he threatened that if Christian made another mistake, he would personally cut off his head. Chris thought that Count Kazar truly had an intimidating aura. Even so, he gathered his courage and said he had come to sincerely apologize for everything he had done. He stated that he was sorry and promised not to make the same mistakes again. However, Kazar was not impressed by his words. He asked if his son really expected him to believe that, given it had only been a few days since the last incident he caused. Trying to remain calm, Chris thought about all the embarrassing stories he had heard about the former owner of that body. There were so many that it was hard to pick just one. Still, he said that his father's mistrust was also his own fault. He admitted that 3 days ago, he hadn't mentioned that he had lost part of his memory, and that now, to recover it, he needed to reflect on everything he had done wrong. He had realized just how wrongly he had lived. Khazar, unmoved, said he had heard enough excuses. Chris, acknowledging this, stated that words truly weren't enough. He said he would prove himself through actions from that moment on. That was why he asked his father to send him to the Cave of Punishment, where he would stay for a month. He believed that was the only way to show he had changed. Then it was explained what the Cave of Punishment was. It was a special prison for high-ranking nobles, a place completely devoid of light, where the 5 senses were blocked. Just a few days there were enough to drive anyone mad. Even so, that was what Chris wanted. He needed to get away from the rumors and prove his worth in a concrete way. Khazar asked if he had any idea what he was requesting and said he doubted he could last even half a day in that place. Chris replied that he fully understood how difficult it would be, but that this was the minimum necessary to regain his father's trust. Khazar then asked if he knew how many times they had already had this same conversation. With every mistake, he became more disappointed. Even so, he decided to accept. He said he would give him one last chance, but if nothing changed after a month, Chris would be banished from the clan. Chris immediately understood that this was almost a death sentence. If he lost the family's protection, the list of people willing to kill him would be endless. Even so, he told his father that he accepted. However, he asked for something in return. If he could prove that he had changed, he wanted the right to make a request. Khazar thought it was arrogant, but agreed. He said that if by some miracle he came back different, then he would have the right to a request, but he made it clear that he didn't believe that would happen. Later, back in his room, Chris was informed by Cox, the butler of House Khazar and a half-vampire, that the Cave of Punishment was ready. Chris was prepared as well. As he walked through the mansion's corridors, he heard the servants and staff whispering about his decision. No one believed he had willingly accepted to go to that place. Some were murmuring about old scandals, like the day he insulted the young mistress of the Poison Clan, forcing Count Khazar himself to apologize to a rival family. They were even making bets on how long he would last in the cave, and the highest bet was just 2 days. Meanwhile, another member of the family was watching him closely. When they reached the entrance to the cave, guarded by 2 undead, Death Knights, it became clear that the place was far more important than it seemed. Even though he had prepared, Chris felt a certain nervousness. Before he could enter, his younger brother called out to him. It was Thorne van Baron Khazar, Christian's legitimate brother, a model student of the family. The first thing Thorne did was draw his sword and place it against Chris's neck. They stared at each other for a moment. Chris, though frightened, didn't show it. He thought that boy clearly wasn't there to wish him good luck. And he was right. Thorne accused him of being a disgrace to the family and declared that if he tarnished the Khazar name again, he would personally end his life. It was his final warning. Chris then remembered that in his past life, he had met Thorne during the era of destruction. He had become a feared demon, a master of curse magic. It was clear he had been rigorously trained. Even with the sword to his neck, Chris calmly said he had understood. He was going. That irritated Thorne. Seeing his brother simply slam the cave door in his face, Thorne was left outraged and speechless. Taking his first step into the Cave of Punishment, Chris realized the atmosphere changed completely. He immediately lost his vision and hearing. He could only feel a slight numbness at the tips of his fingers. That was probably so prisoners could still feel around the few objects they were allowed to bring, ensuring they wouldn't starve. A regular human would quickly go insane in that environment. But for Chris, it was irrelevant. He had already faced the worst of the era of destruction, and that was precisely what he wanted. Total isolation, so he could clearly look inward. Without that, he wouldn't be able to repair the broken body he had been reborn into. He knew the process required time and luck, but he relied on his knowledge of the Divine Doctor's medical arts, as well as a technique called bone comprehension, which he had modified based on something he had learned at the circus. And finally, he also had access to valuable magic stones with unique properties. He could hardly believe he had managed to buy them. The stones were extremely expensive, but now that he was part of the elite, his requests were granted. In his previous life, he and Evan had fought hard just to get a single one of those stones. To begin his reconstruction process, Chris used the white magic stone, known for purifying toxins. This stage was tedious, but essential. He had to use the white mana contained in the stone to carefully remove any toxin buildup in his body. A single mistake could cause intense and widespread pain. Even so, he carried out the purification process with ease, as if it were simple. Meanwhile, outside the cave, Khazar asked Cox how Christian was doing. The butler replied that he had obediently entered the Cave of Punishment, but admitted he was concerned. He said that if anything happened in there, Chris would have no way to call for help. That made Khazar question whether he had made a mistake by sending him. He remembered when his son was just a child with great potential, and wondered when things started to fall apart. Perhaps, he thought, the gifts he gave him during childhood had made him arrogant. Maybe he himself had shaped his son's problematic personality. Even so, he preferred to see him dead than to allow him to keep living in that disgraceful way. Despite these doubts, Khazar recalled his son's words about proving himself through actions. He tried to push away any hope, reminding himself that Chris had disappointed him too many times. He then asked Cox if he had noticed anything strange when Christian entered the cave. The butler hesitated, visibly nervous, but Khazar demanded honesty. Cox then revealed that Chris had entered with some magic stones, including the Dream Stone, known for inducing hallucinations. Since they didn't know the side effects of using that inside the cave, they had considered opening it immediately. But Khazar decided against it. He said that if that was the case, then let him die. 1 month later, Khazar returned to the cave to retrieve his son. He expected to find a broken boy, but to his surprise, the doors opened and Chris walked out normally. He was calm, composed, and said he had been waiting for him. He asked if his father was surprised. He said he had promised to return as a new man. Khazar's reaction was one of shock, and for a moment, he was even moved. Chris thought he hadn't seen that look in his father's eyes since childhood. Khazar acknowledged that his son had endured much longer than he expected, but made it clear he still didn't trust him. Chris replied that he understood and would have to work hard. Internally, he knew his father believed he had barely survived the experience, but that wasn't the case. He had been too busy training. His initial goal was to obtain the ideal body for mastering the sword. Thanks to the white mana stone, every cell in his body now pulsed with life. The Dream Stone also played a crucial role. Cox had tried to stop him from using it, fearing he would become disoriented, but the hallucinations had allowed him to accelerate his physical transformation process dramatically. With that, Chris had managed to create 2 magical cores. In theory, his power was already immense. He quickly mastered the first star spell called Louise. After all, like it or not, Chris was still a genius, both in his past life and this one. To protect himself, he used his darkness core to conceal his light core. He knew that if the demons found out he was using light magic, there would be an uproar. If everything had ended there, it would already have been a great victory. But then he noticed something strange. He found another magic stone, and upon examining it, realized it was yet another dream stone. He understood that someone was conspiring to make him fail that test. However, instead of getting angry, he decided to use that person as a stepping stone to become even stronger. After fulfilling his promise, Chris sought out his father and said he wanted to make his request. Khazar allowed it, and Chris declared that he wanted to go to the training grounds of the Black Swamp Knights. The Count reacted with surprise. He said that a nobody like him had no place there, as those knights were part of one of the 3 founding orders of the Dark Magic clan, and were all elite warriors. But Chris explained that he didn't want to join the order, only to observe the training. He believed he could learn something by watching them in action. Khazar agreed, but warned him not to cause any problems. Chris then took the opportunity to say that he had one more request. Shortly after, the scene shifted to the training center. The Black Swamp Knights were gathered, and as expected, all eyes turned toward Chris with suspicion as he prepared to train. The murmurs began. Someone asked if that was the young master known for causing trouble. Chris thought it was natural to receive that kind of reception. After all, in that place, strength mattered more than social status, and he knew that no one there liked him. But there was a greater reason behind his presence. He wanted to gain access to the library. For that, he needed a letter of recommendation from the vice commander. Only with that letter could he obtain the key to the library, and that was his second request. There, in the heavily guarded halls, were all the clan's dark magic grimoires, and to truly learn dark magic, that was where he needed to go. Chris wondered why his father had placed a condition on his continued presence, considering he was still a member of the clan. That was when he remembered his father mentioning the incident in the black market, where he had tried to sell forbidden grimoires. Reflecting on it, Chris concluded that the previous owner of that body had indeed been a disaster, and everything he had received so far was well deserved. Even so, his top priority at that moment was to earn the vice commander's recognition. But then, Thorne suddenly appeared and began provoking him, saying that the place wasn't meant for a worm like him. Chris recognized the boy's irritating face, but quickly realized it could be a good opportunity. Thorne declared that it was his final warning and told him to leave before ending up back in the Cave of Punishment. Chris countered by asking if he had any proof for what he was saying, reminding him that their own father had allowed him to be there. At that moment, a new figure appeared. It was Vice Commander Melon, who said she respected the Count's decision, but stated that Christian was not a trustworthy person. Chris analyzed the situation, realizing she possessed at least 4-star dark magic and was trying to intimidate him with her dark aura. However, he was already used to that kind of threat and simply bowed respectfully before her. Melon was surprised that he had resisted the dark energy, but Chris maintained his composure and thought that with the Vice Commander's intervention, there was no more avoiding it. He would have to prove that he was worthy of using that training field. Melon herself asked if he was willing to fight one of the demons present and win. To her her, Chris's actions had already crossed the line into insolence, but Chris responded firmly, explaining that he only wished she would refrain from using dark magic. He said that due to the negligent lifestyle of the former owner of that body, his compatibility with dark energy was very low. For that reason, he proposed an unarmed duel. Melon considered that even if it was only a duel, she could not allow the heir to be seriously injured, which would be a serious problem. She asked if he believed he had any chance without weapons. Chris replied that there was only one way to find out. Already determined, he pointed to Thorne as his opponent, saying he would serve quite well for this test. Thorne, outraged, demanded to know how he dared challenge him, but Melon acknowledged that he was actually the most suitable opponent. After all, Thorne was at the second star, which was already a rare feat for someone only 13 years old. Age didn't matter, 13, 23, or 33. Without talent, no one would ever reach that level. But Chris was no ordinary person either. He declared that if he needed to prove his worth, he would have to fight someone stronger than himself. That was why Thorne was the best choice. He even taunted him, asking if his little brother was scared. Thorne accepted the duel. Later, the two were surrounded by a group ready to fight. Most people were cheering for Thorne, hoping he would crush Chris. Chris in turn asked what the conditions for victory would be. Melon replied that the fight would end when one of them could no longer continue fighting. She thought Chris was being absurdly insolent and didn't even know his place. However, Chris kept provoking and asked if his opponent had understood the rules, implying that everyone thought he was going to get beaten up. Thorne was enraged by the comments and promised he would make Chris regret it, guaranteeing he would never open his mouth again. But it was Chris who attacked first. He slapped Thorne in the face so fast that he couldn't even react. Chris sarcastically warned him that the fight had already started. Furious, Thorne tried to strike back, but completely missed. Chris, with the experience from his past life, knew that this was practically cheating. In an unarmed duel, he could use refined techniques that surpassed dark energy. With a precise move, he landed a knee to Thorne's stomach, reminding him that he had reached the 3-star level using light power inside the Cave of Punishment. Everyone was shocked to see him spitting blood. Mocking him, Chris asked if he was crying and if he wanted a little cuddle. Thorne, confused, wanted to know what trick he was using. Chris replied that he wasn't using any tricks. It was just that the other guy was too weak. Still, Thorne, determined, gathered dark energy and promised to kill him. Chris liked the aggressive stance. He noted that his opponent was fast, but he kept dodging every attack. He thought it still wasn't enough. When Thorne tried to strike with full force, Chris completely blocked and dissipated all of his dark energy, counterattacking with a precise uppercut to the chin. For him, fighting was a matter of instinct and reflex. Thorne fell without resistance, and everyone around was in shock. They couldn't believe what they had just seen. Even Melon was stunned. It simply made no sense to anyone. Then, with a calm and confident tone, Chris asked if he had now proven himself worthy. Melon, still shocked by the outcome of the duel, ended up confirming that he had proven himself. Chris, satisfied, responded naturally and thought it had been great. He was relieved. From now on, he could learn all the magic and swordsmanship he wanted. Later, Chris was analyzing his own progress with dark magic. He had finally reached the 1-star level. He reflected that because he wasn't used to that type of energy, it had taken him a little longer than expected, but he had still managed it. Even so, he knew he needed to develop that power while also improving his light magic. When he rang the small bell on the dresser, a spectral servant appeared before him. It was Marie, his personal attendant. She asked if he had called her. Chris thought that the Banshee, the spirit inhabiting Marie, was of a very high level, which made it impressive to have her as a maid. Considering all the wrongs the former Chris had done, maybe it made sense. However, he decided that later on he would replace her. At that moment, he just asked for some juice. Marie asked if he wanted juice with human blood or something like that, but Chris replied that he preferred strawberry. She insisted, saying blood juice was delicious, but he reaffirmed that what he really wanted was strawberry juice. Later, while walking, Cox called out to him, noticing he was going to train early once again. He showed concern, thinking that such frequent training could end up hurting the young master. Still, he was proud of Chris's new, more disciplined and committed attitude. He warned, however, that too many people were watching his steps, which could be dangerous. Chris listened to what he said, but didn't respond directly. He thought to himself about the boldness of that man, and only said that he had never asked for his opinion. Who was Cox to decide anything about his path? Cox then bowed and apologized, wishing him a good training session. Chris still thought there was something strange about that man. He was definitely hiding something. Later, Chris was at the training grounds with the Knights of the Black Swamp. He noticed that everyone had been acting more restrained around him lately. Finally, it seemed like he could relax a bit and train more calmly. But when training started, he noticed that one of the soldiers was watching him closely. Soon after, that same soldier ran to the vice commander's tent to inform her that Chris had arrived. He said Chris had been training every day, always at the same time. When Melon was informed, she became thoughtful. She wondered what he was planning and still remembered the previous duel. Chris's movements had been truly impressive, especially when he completely dissipated Thorne's dark energy. She questioned whether he truly had that level of talent. If he did, maybe he could even surpass Lord Eshid, the direct heir of the family. But she quickly dismissed the thought. To her, Chris was still just a degenerate bastard who had wasted all his dark energy with that disgraceful lifestyle. There was no chance he could reach that level of power. With the noise increasing outside, Melon left the tent. A soldier explained that there had just been a small disagreement between Chris and another group member. People commented that the defeated soldier was Cannon, a one-star warrior. Now that Chris had also reached 1 star, everyone began wondering how he managed that so quickly. Chris, surrounded by the knights, provoked them by saying he wanted to see the great feats of the famous warriors of the Black Swamp. In his opinion so far, they didn't live up to their reputation. He asked if anyone else was willing to face him, or if they were all just cowards. His words irritated the soldiers. One of the soldiers, named Thorne, stepped forward promptly. Chris thought he had fallen perfectly into his trap. He smiled inwardly and accepted the challenge. Thorne, saying nothing, advanced seriously. He hadn't expected a bastard like that to have learned so many secret techniques. He thought he would now have to teach that insolent boy a lesson. But Chris surprised him. Watching Thorne's movements, he quickly realized he was facing the legendary swordsmanship of the Black Swamp, the same one he had heard so much about. And with his observational skills and past life experience, he managed to learn the patterns just by watching. With that, he landed a powerful blow on Thorne. Melon, who was watching the fight, could hardly believe it. After a while, Thorne was completely defeated. Chris even used him as a footstool. The surrounding soldiers began to wonder if he was really that powerful. How could someone reach 1 star so quickly? Chris then commented that the vice commander must be disappointed with her own knights. With such weak abilities, she should bear at least some responsibility. The soldiers were surprised by his boldness in speaking to Melon like that. Trying to remain calm, Melon said she understood the young master was excited about his sudden victory, but thought he was talking too much. Chris, however, did not back down. He asked why she didn't show some of her own skills. Melon simply drew her sword and struck the ground with a single blow, opening a deep fissure. She declared that she could deal with someone like him in just 1 second. Chris asked if she intended to use all her power in that duel. He thought that would be a bit unfair. He proposed that she use only the power equivalent to 1 star. Melon smiled and accepted. She said that with that level of power, she could easily break both his legs. Chris then reaffirmed that he was putting his legs at risk in the duel, but wanted to see what she could do. Melon replied that it was fine because it was impossible for her to lose. When the duel began, it became clear that her strikes were very hard to block. Her speed was impressive, and the knights watching couldn't hide their astonishment. It was unbelievable that Chris was managing to handle the vice commander in direct combat, even though her main weapon was a heavy sword. Unlike the light one he used, Melon was surprised. For some reason, her attacks weren't hitting Chris, and she began to think that someone as weak as him should have been easily defeated. She recalled his fight against Thorne, which had also seemed unusual. She wondered what exactly had happened to that boy. Meanwhile, Chris was observing the situation and concluded that things were clearly not going as she expected. Melon then ordered him to shut up and began gathering a large amount of dark energy. She followed with a powerful strike, but Chris dodged and used the opening to land a headbutt on Melon, causing her to bleed. He realized the strategy worked. Melon's specialty was the enchanted sword, and with her dark magic limited at that moment, her defense was exposed. A direct physical blow, taking advantage of that opening, would be effective, and that's exactly what happened. Instead of getting angry, Melon burst out laughing. She admitted to herself that she never imagined being headbutted, and realized she had greatly underestimated the young master. From that moment on, she decided to fight more seriously. But Chris asked if the battle hadn't already ended. After all, he had managed to scratch her neck with his own nails. He thought that if his nails had been poisoned, what would have happened to her? Melon then accepted the defeat and asked what he wanted in return. However, she imposed a condition. She wanted another opportunity to fight him. Chris said that to accept a rematch, he would need something very good in exchange. He then approached her, and in a low voice so the surrounding soldiers wouldn't hear, asked if she could kneel before him. Melon immediately refused. She said it was impossible because her loyalty belonged to the main family, the House of Baron. Chris replied that he knew that, but everything could be resolved if he became the young master of the main clan. Melon was surprised by the proposal. She thought it was absurd, as the 5 recognized young masters with succession rights were all descendants of the main family. But Chris stated that there was no rule forbidding it, and asked if, within a month, she could reconsider. She said that after a month, he would have no chance of defeating her. Chris, confident, said that very few things are truly impossible in this world and said goodbye, telling her he would see her in a month. He thought that by then, she would place her loyalty in him. Later, Chris presented his father with a letter of recommendation signed by Vice Commander Melon. Count Cassar read the letter, which contained praise for Chris's foundations, with the note that he still needed to focus more on his training. The Count remembered the conversation he had with Melon, in which she admitted the boy was a genius. Even with a low star rank, he had defeated opponents with stronger magical foundations and had even surpassed her in combat. She declared it was one of the rare fights in which she had enjoyed herself. Count Cassar was impressed. He wondered if Chris had actually done something good this time. Seeing his father's expression, Chris asked if there was something on his face, but the Count simply said no, and as promised, handed him the key to the library. Later, Chris silently celebrated. He had completed the mission. He thought that Melon was a demon from the main family of the Dark Magic clan, and had been very active during the era of destruction. As a 6-star warrior, if he could take control of the Dark Magic clan, she could become part of his people. He hadn't fully secured that position yet, but he believed a month would be enough. After all, he was a genius. Thinking about Count Cassar, he remembered the expression on his face. Maybe it had been pride. Could demons also have family bonds and care for their children? Maybe he was a better father than the one Chris had in his past life. Because of that, he promised himself that he wouldn't disappoint him. In the library, he was impressed by the variety of books. There were titles on blood magic, summoning studies, curses, and even forbidden knowledge from the domain of light. When he picked up the first grimoire, he saw Marie watching from afar. He asked why she was there, and Marie replied naturally. After all, she was the librarian. She asked if he wanted to monopolize the library for himself. He told her to shut up, and she commented that his direct language even made her heart skip a beat. Although Chris didn't seem pleased with the situation. Later, Marie explained that the grimoire he had chosen contained a 4-star spell called Binding Seal. She said that perhaps he wasn't capable of understanding that type of magic, but Chris confidently replied that it was fine because he was a genius. Marie remained silent for a while, just watching him, and then said that he really was amazing, but he replied that she didn't need to be so fake. Marie then asked if there was a specific reason why he had chosen that book, and Chris confirmed that there was. He needed to capture a certain little rat. The next morning, he returned to his training and thought about the possible suspects. The first potential one was Thorne, since no one despised him more in that house. The second was Cox, who, despite not being a direct descendant of the clan, had free access to the Cave of Punishment. He knew that demons valued power more than status, but Cox's behavior seemed suspicious. Chris suspected there might be a third person involved, but he wasn't sure yet. The important thing was to find out who had left that mana stone in the Cave of Punishment to sabotage him while he was there. He wondered if he should act like an idiot again, trying to deceive his enemies. He found that kind of thinking exhausting. He grumbled to himself that thinking too much was tiring, and then muttered that the others could keep having fun, because he was already on his way out. Soon after, some people began to wonder what had happened to Chris. Later, he returned to acting irresponsibly. He broke a plate, wasted food, and even yelled at the maid, saying she should prepare a real meal and ordering her to redo everything. Duke Cassar, observing all that, concluded that he had been foolish to believe his son had truly matured. Disappointed, he left the dinner table without saying anything else. Chris, on the other hand, felt a bit guilty, but he knew he had to keep pretending to be a fool. He was working to spread rumors that he had gone back to being a useless noble. He started bothering the maids during cleaning, spending money recklessly, and behaving like an arrogant aristocrat. Meanwhile, Marie served him a glass of wine, but Chris complained, saying that it wasn't real wine. Marie insisted that it was, but he claimed he saw her remove all the alcohol. Marie, with a slight smile, explained that he didn't have a good history with alcohol. Then she asked if he had returned to being a bastard, but added that it was fine because she wanted to stay by his side forever. Chris replied that it wasn't like that. He was just trying to catch a rat. Marie then asked if he was already able to use the Binding Seal spell, and he confidently said that he was a genius. He wasn't just misbehaving, he had also been studying that spell for quite some time. Marie admitted that maybe he really was a genius, but at that moment, Thorne appeared, and Chris quickly thought he needed to pretend to be drunk. With a confused expression, he asked why Thorne was there. Thorne looked at him with disdain and asked if that was the best his brother could do, because he had really believed Chris had changed. Chris realized that Thorne seemed genuinely upset, which made him think that maybe his brother wasn't the traitor. He then told him that there was a rat infiltrated in that house, someone who wanted to see him fall, or even die. He said that was why he was playing along with that person's game. He picked up the glass and told Thorne to smell it, revealing that it was fake wine, with no alcohol. Thorne asked who he suspected, but Chris replied that it was still hard to say, though he was certain that soon the person would fall into the trap. Right after, Chris let the glass fall on purpose. A servant rushed over to see what had happened, and once again Chris was cruel to him. Thorne watched, and started to think that Chris was acting very well. well, maybe even too well. Later, Chris went to see Cox. He placed a bottle of wine on the table and, without saying a word, poured its entire contents over his head. He asked why they were underestimating his tastes, since that wasn't the wine he had ordered. Cox, surprised, tried to stay calm and said he would arrange a new bottle, but Chris told him to go get it himself. Cox replied that he was busy, and Chris insisted, saying that if he didn't want to be replaced, he should go now. Visibly irritated, Cox left, saying he would be back soon. Chris thought that Cox deserved praise for enduring so much humiliation, but he also noticed how hostile he had become. That's when he noticed some documents on the table, soaked in wine. Analyzing them carefully, he thought he might have found something important. If Cox was the traitor, maybe he was involved in some kind of financial manipulation. But that still wasn't enough proof. He needed something more concrete. He thanked him for the new bottle and asked if Cox was angry. He replied no, and Chris commented that was why he considered him his favorite. At that moment, Cox informed him that there was a message for him. Some friends wanted to meet him in secret in the usual place. Chris, suspicious, asked who those friends were. Cox said he wasn't implying anything, just that by the location they seemed to be familiar. Chris agreed to go, thinking that things were going even better than he expected. Later, during a kind of brunch with these so-called friends, some of them started commenting on the recent rumors that he had changed. They said he seemed to be the best among them, but Chris paid attention to the maid serving the drinks. She was a very young girl, and he thought it was sad to see her serving alcohol to that group of drunks. When one of them, a fat man, ordered Chris to drink, he simply threw the contents of the glass in his face. The man spat out the wine, outraged, and asked what he was doing. Chris replied that, judging by his reaction, the wine seemed to be contaminated. He charged his finger with magic and placed it on the maid's forehead, which caught everyone's attention. They asked if he was using dark magic, and Chris answered that they shouldn't be surprised. Then he grabbed the heads of the two men and slammed them down hard on the table. Some started asking him to calm down, but Chris insisted that if they didn't confess what they had done, they would die right there. The two ended up tied up, and after some torture, one of them confessed that they had been ordered to drug him during the meeting and then kill the maid. The fat man said they had been threatened to go through with it. Chris asked who had given the order. At first, no one wanted to speak, but when he threatened to cut off one of their toys, the man gave in and confessed that the one behind it was Cox. Chris asked if they swore on their lives, and both confirmed it. Faced with that, he replied that he accepted their oath. Chris looked at the two captured young men and ordered them to listen carefully to the task he was about to give them. Then, he cast the binding seal on both, establishing control over them. Later, Cox went to Grand Duke Cassar, saying there was a serious problem. He claimed that the young master had committed a murder. He said Chris got drunk during the night and killed someone, throwing the body into the river. He asked his lord what they should do about it. Duke Cassar, serious, ordered that Chris be brought to court immediately. He would use his authority to conduct a direct judgment, which was exactly what Cox wanted. In court, Chris declared that he was innocent. Cassar asked if he really intended to lie, since there were witnesses to what had happened. Chris remained calm and stated that it never happened. He asked how there could be witnesses to something that did not exist. He said it must all be a big misunderstanding. He revealed that the supposed dead person was alive and pointed to a young woman who entered the court right after. Her presence shocked the nobles. The girl said the young master had taken her home after she suddenly lost consciousness and even gave her money to pay her family's bills. Then she pointed to the two nobles and stated that they were the ones who had drugged the young master's drink. At that moment, the game completely turned in Chris's favor. He thought it was time for the climax. He used the binding seal again on the two nobles, who, under the effect of the magic, confessed that the testimonies were false. They also said that the one who orchestrated everything was the butler Cox. Outraged, Cox asked what kind of audacity that was. He denied everything, saying that the young master and his friends were trying to ruin his reputation. He claimed that the joke had gone too far, but Chris already knew Cox would react like that. Chris then asked the court for permission to act as the prosecutor in the trial, claiming to be the victim of the incident and wanting to personally interrogate the butler Cox. Duke Cassar hesitated but eventually allowed it, on the condition that if Chris committed any excess, his right would be immediately revoked. Chris agreed and said it wouldn't take long. Then he firmly declared his position as a representative of the great ruler of the Magic Empire, His Majesty the Demon Emperor, as a member of the Black Magic clan that ruled the eastern region of the Southern Magic Kingdom, and as the direct representative of Count Cassar. He then began the formal interrogation. Chris asked if Cox solemnly swore to tell only the truth. Cox swore before the court. Chris repeated the question, reinforcing the commitment to honesty. The moment Cox reaffirmed, he was struck by the binding seal. He felt intense pain in his head and soon noticed the magical symbol on his forehead. The people present were surprised to recognize the seal and wondered how a mere boy could use a 4-star magic. Chris thought that the seal had been specially modified to work even with a lower ranking, as long as the target swore twice. And Cox had fallen right into that trap. Confused, Cox asked what he had done. Chris ignored the reaction and asked directly why he had hired the two nobles to drug him. When he tried to lie, Cox was immediately forced by the seal to tell the truth. He said he had received orders. A certain man knew about the corruption he was involved in and threatened him, ordering him to ruin the young master's reputation again. Chris then asked if, by corruption, he meant the embezzlement he had been committing for some time. He said he already knew about it and had asked the other butler for proof. He ordered him to say the name of the mastermind. With no way out, Cox revealed that the one responsible was Sir Eshid, the second son of the main family of the Black Magic clan, Eshid Baron. Overcome by despair, he thought he would be killed on the spot and tried to run, but Chris drew his sword and executed the traitor in front of everyone. Duke Kassar was not expecting that and asked why he had made that decision without consulting anyone. Chris explained that Cox had lied before the court and directly betrayed a legitimate heir. Therefore, under the court's authority, he punished him for his crimes. He said that if Cox left alive, the main family would try to fabricate evidence and cover up the incident. He stated they could not leave any openings. He wanted to make sure everyone there remembered the truth. Eshid tried to sabotage him. The Grand Duke then opened a portal and asked Chris to follow him. When they arrived on the other side, Kassar revealed that they were in a secret training center, far from unwanted ears. He said that in the courtroom, many people were listening, and he wanted to talk more freely. Chris stated that Eshid would still cause many problems because of the succession dispute. The Duke replied that the power and authority of a family are directly tied to the successor it supports. He admitted that Chris's decision had been correct, though perhaps a bit rushed. He said that given the current situation, there was no other choice but to support the first young master. However, he also said that this was not the best option, since that heir was a bloodthirsty lunatic. Chris then suggested another alternative. He said he himself could become the successor. Duke Kassar considered the idea absurd, but Chris insisted. He said he knew that even someone from a branch family could be recognized as a successor. The Duke replied that this was a rule that existed only on paper and had never actually been applied. Chris then asked why Eshid would have gone through the trouble of sabotaging him if he posed no threat. Duke Kassar revealed that, as a child, Chris had clearly been more talented than Eshid, but over time he had been left behind. Chris declared that he would reclaim what he had lost, but for that, he needed his father's help. Finally, he asked him to use his authority to recommend him for the sacred ritual of darkness, which would take place in 2 months. Duke Kassar explained that to participate in the sacred ritual of darkness, one must have at least 2 stars. He knew that Chris had just reached the first, but the boy assured him that he would achieve the second within 2 months. He then asked for his father's support. Days later, the mansion's servants were commenting among themselves that the young master was different. He trained alone every day with great discipline. He went through the same harsh exercises as the Knights of the Dark Swamp, and everyone wondered how long he would last at that pace. During one of the training sessions, Chris was practicing mud fencing, which focused on entangling the enemy before finishing them with the Black Scythe. He wanted to confirm with his father if he was doing it correctly. Duke Kassar observed that he had initially only taught the Black Scythe technique, but Chris quickly understood the mechanics. He questioned whether it was really necessary to keep the 2 techniques separate. He considered a more efficient method. Soon after, when a monstrous mushroom appeared in the training room, Chris easily cut off its legs. The Duke was impressed. He knew that mud fencing should not have been enough to cause that kind of cut, but Chris explained that he had used the energy of the Black Scythe combined with the mud technique. Internally, the Duke was completely shocked, but he maintained his composure and only commented that it was a powerful technique. He said that using 2 techniques at the same time would make it harder to cast curses, but Chris assured him that it was not. In fact, it had become even easier. That left the Duke speechless. 15 days later, Chris was already exhausted. Running every day was very difficult, but he needed more energy. Mine approached and asked if he was already worn out, reminding him that the day of the duel was coming, and she still expected him to keep his promise. Chris thought that woman always had a striking presence. He said he was doing his best to meet her expectations. Melon acknowledged his progress, but commented that with only 1 star, he would never be able to make her kneel. Chris replied that he still believed it could happen, and that the duel would be a great opportunity to test his knowledge. Melon smiled, saying he was still full of energy, and that she hoped he would surpass his limits. Chris knew that she had 4 stars, and within each stage, there were still 3 levels: lower, middle, and upper. He, on the other hand, was only at 1 star, upper stage, far below Melon's level. However, he thought that at least he came from a wealthy family. Back in the room, he asked Marie if she had already packed her bag for the trip. She cheerfully replied that yes, everything was ready. She commented that it was their first outing together, and that she had put extra effort into her appearance. Chris reminded her that he had never said he would take her. Marie joked, saying he just didn't want to admit it, and that it was a pleasure to accompany him. Chris then decided to talk to his father about Marie, asking if he could replace his personal servant with a human. The Duke denied it. He explained that she was a high-ranking banshee and was only controllable because of the magical contract they had. Chris asked if there was any way to cancel that contract. Duke Kasar replied, somewhat hesitant, that maybe only with a kiss, since she was a banshee. Chris thought that was no help at all. Even so, he went back to talk to Marie, saying she could not come along because they would be going to crowded places. Marie, frustrated, said she was excited to go out since she had been trapped in that mansion for decades. Chris then looked directly at her and gave in. He said she could come, but asked her not to embarrass him in public. She was overjoyed and praised her young master while he ordered her to follow him. Marie asked where exactly they were going. Chris replied that it would be a place where they could make a profit, but Marie enthusiastically shook her dress and dropped several coins. Chris said that wasn't enough and told her to put them away. She asked if he wanted gold, land, what exactly he wanted. Chris replied that he wanted something very useful, something he used regularly. When they arrived at the carriage, Thorne was already there. He complained that Chris was late. Surprised, Chris asked why his brother was also there. Thorne explained that he would come along to make sure he didn't act like an idiot again. Chris replied that it wasn't necessary as his only goal was to gamble. He said that as demons, it was natural to be involved with alcohol and games, and even the Demon Emperor recommended gambling, so it was all fine. Thorne declared that he would follow him anyway, and Chris asked if he was worried about his big brother. Thorne said he was actually worried about the family's reputation. Chris provocatively said that even a nerd like him could be useful in gambling. Thorne asked if gambling wasn't just a matter of luck, but Chris said he would prove there was much more to it, and that he would make Thorne lower that stuck-up nose. Chris thought that the bait that day would be a sweet and innocent child. Later, already in a luxurious place, Thorne commented that he never imagined seeing such a beautiful place. Even Marie, normally indifferent, said her heart was beating faster. Chris then asked Thorne to put on a mask as a disguise and told Marie to hide so no one would see her. He called her closer and said he wanted to whisper a secret. Marie approached with a smile and obediently said she would follow his orders. Meanwhile, Thorne, confused, looked around and asked where Marie had gone. Chris said not to worry, as they needed to enter quickly. They went to a betting house where everyone wore masks, and the environment seemed well attended. However, the patrons began to look at them strangely, as they were very young. Many probably thought those newcomers were rich kids from noble families, bold enough to walk alone into the tiger's den. Trying to ease the mood, Chris proposed a challenge to Thorne, whoever made more money in 1 hour. If Thorne won, Chris would call him Big Brother for a month, but if he lost, he would have to call him Honorable Your Majesty Brother. Even with the provocation, Chris made it clear that Thorne didn't have to accept if he was afraid. Thorne, however, grabbed the money bag and confidently replied that he was not scared and that he would win that bet. Shortly after, Chris participated in another game and came out victorious. A gentleman beside him praised his skill, but Chris inwardly understood the strategy. He knew that when someone new arrived, they were usually allowed to win a decent amount before being led to total loss. It was a common trick, used to build the confidence of newcomers until they lost everything. Meanwhile, Thorne was irritated, shouting that he knew that card was good and didn't understand why he had lost. Chris joked, asking if he wanted to go home, drink milk, and lie in bed. In response, Thorne asked if Chris hadn't lost money too. Chris admitted he had, 500 rupees, but Thorne replied that he had lost 1,000, and because of that, everyone around started murmuring, commenting on the situation. Chris, observing people's reactions, thought it was great. They were already realizing that the real fool there was Thorne, and he intended to take advantage of that opportunity. He asked if Thorne still wanted to continue, and he said yes, demanding more money. Chris, pretending to be concerned, said he had tried to warn him and didn't want to be blamed later. But in truth, everything was part of his plan from the beginning. Thorne returned to gambling and drew even more attention. Everyone was watching him, trying to see the cards he was holding. And as expected, he lost again, the victim of a scam. At that moment, Marie appeared next to Chris and said she had found the man he wanted to meet. Meanwhile, Thorne was screaming in despair for having lost 10,000 rupees. Later, at the designated location, Marie easily opened the door. The guards asked who that young man was, and Chris, removing his mask, revealed his identity. Everyone recognized him as the young master. Surprised, they asked why why he was there, and then Grantel, the master of the Merchant Guild, appeared. Grantel, upon seeing who it was, politely asked the reason for the visit. Chris replied that he wanted a private conversation. He knew that although known as a merchant, Grantel was actually the true owner of the casino. He also said that his younger brother had been deceived and found it bold of Grantel to ask what the matter was about. When Grantel asked who the said brother was, Chris replied that it was the heir of Count Khazar, Thorne. Frightened, Grantel claimed he only managed the casino and had no connection with what the others had done. Marie then intervened, threatening him and asking if he wanted to die. Desperate, Grantel apologized, saying that if he had known Chris was the Count's son, he would never have done such a thing. He begged for mercy and asked how much he should pay as compensation. Chris suggested 1 million rupees, which Grantel said he did not have. So Chris proposed 200,000, which he considered sufficient. Grantel, surprised by the amount, asked if that was all. Chris replied no, there was one more thing. Later, Marie commented that he had used the extorted money to buy battle equipment and said it was a brilliant scheme. Chris stated that, of course it was great, because he was a genius. Among the items acquired was a special sword, the Grenade, a sacred blade obtained by a hero of the past who had offered his soul to a demon. The sword was highly desired by demons, but was now rusted. Even so, it was part of Chris's plan. He asked Marie to carry the sword and gave it to her as a gift for her good work. He said she seemed to have not yet overcome her regrets, and if she didn't, he hoped that gift would help her find peace and move forward. He asked her not to misunderstand. Marie, moved, said it was the first time before or after death that she had received a gift like that. She thanked him, even though she didn't have a heart. Chris, clearly embarrassed, replied evasively, but Marie was very happy and promised, as a thank you, to put all her heart into preparing a very tasty blood juice for him. Chris immediately rejected the idea, saying he wouldn't drink that. Marie then asked what he thought was in strawberry juice. Chris, confused, felt like he was forgetting something. He said he would remember later. What he had forgotten was poor Thorne, who was still in the betting house, left with only a single rupee. The next morning, Thorne returned furious, waking Chris up and asking why he had been abandoned. He said that luckily someone recognized him inside. Chris, still sleepy, simply replied with an apology. Chris thought that at least someone had helped him, which was already something good. Then he asked if they weren't referring to him the wrong way. In the end, he had lost the bet and forgotten about it, so now he would have to call him esteemed Your Majesty. Brother. Thorne was very irritated and repeated the words angrily, calling him esteemed, damned esteemed, esteemed Your Majesty brother. Chris merely commented that his brother deserved respect. Thorne promised that one day he would get his revenge and that Chris should prepare himself. Chris reflected that this lovely child was the one who killed him in his past life, probably because of Eshid, the son of Langham, who currently acted as the head of the Black Magic clan and was the young master and official successor. Chris did not feel guilty for him. After all, he wasn't the real Christian, but if he wanted to become the next official heir, he would have to face him sooner or later. It was clear that Eshid would retaliate, but for that, he would need the Grenade. Looking at his sword and new equipment, Chris thought about it. Later, he took the sword to study it. Many demons throughout history had tried to wield this sacred sword, but the reason it was treated only as an antique was simple. No one could truly control it. Chris told himself he would see how it reacted to him. After freeing it from its chains, he received a shock that left his hand numb. Maybe it was expected, since it was an artifact created to use the sacred power of light. In the end, it was just a weapon, and if he could analyze the mechanism behind it and understand why it rejected demonic energy, he could make progress. One of his new pieces of equipment was a blacksmith's hammer. When he struck hard, the hammer broke. He tried another, and then another. He was determined to keep striking until the sword gave in. The sword itself seemed afraid. A few days later, at the secret training center, his father asked if everything was ready, and Chris replied yes. Only then did he notice who the visitor was, becoming visibly nervous. It was the commander of the Black Knights, Marion, who commented that it had been a long time since she had seen her nephew. She was the daughter of the former clan chief, elder sister of Count Khazar, protector of the elders, and responsible for secret missions and surveillance. She was part of the clan's elite. Chris wondered what someone so important was doing there, but the Count explained that it was just a visit to deal with matters related to Cox, not an official visit. Marion commented that the old man had been quite bold. Chris suspected the elder wanted to protect Eshid, which made the situation problematic. He commented that the elder seemed to have plenty of time to deal with trivial matters, and Marion replied that he obviously didn't care about children's fights, but seemed interested in Chris. Chris reflected that maybe this was a good opportunity. Marion then asked if it was courage or foolishness. He hadn't even reached the second star yet, but he was challenging Melon. She asked if he didn't want to cancel the duel. Chris thanked her for the concern, but made it clear he had his own plans. When Marion saw the sword he was carrying, she was surprised. It was really the Grenade. She already thought he caused trouble, but this was even worse. Marion asked Redan if he hadn't changed for the better, and the Count confirmed that he had. Even so, Marion wanted to know why he was using a sacred sword in a duel. Chris asked if it wasn't allowed, reminding her that the only explicit condition was to win. There was no rule against using the sword. Marion warned that even the clan elder had failed to tame the Grenade, a sword with enough power to burn someone to ashes. Chris then drew the broken sword. Marion asked if it was a replica, and he offered for her to check it herself. When she grabbed the sword, she was burned by the divine light and threw it to the ground. Shocked, she asked how he was doing that. Chris replied that it was a state secret, but assured her that the only reason he could wield it was because he was a genius. The Count was extremely proud of his son. Melon had already arrived and said the young master was still as amusing as ever. She remarked that even if he had tamed a sacred sword as a demon, it wouldn't matter, because he would lose anyway. She then launched an attack with her heavy sword. Just that first strike was very difficult for Chris to block. He realized her power and speed were unmatched. There might be nothing he could do with such a huge difference. But then he decided to use divine energy against Melon's dark energy. Marion noticed that the divine energy was directly opposing the black energy and wondered how he had reached that level at such a young age. Melon observed that he wasn't just using divine energy, but mixing it with dark energy while wielding the sword. Not even Marion could defend properly against it. The Count asked if the dark energy was floating around him, but Marion answered no. He was controlling the energy with simple movements, nullifying the divine energy's rejection. Chris asked how Melon was doing and if she was enjoying the fight. Melon said she had already noticed that he was predicting her movements. Chris replied that he was just a good observer. Every sword technique had a preparatory stance. One had to raise their arms to strike downward, and for that, the shoulder and upper body muscles would move. That was something both novices and experts did the same way. Melon then asked what he would do about the next move. She used dark magic and easily immobilized Chris, reminding him not to forget she was a magic knight. However, Chris quickly freed himself using divine power, thinking it would be a little harder. Melon became suspicious and asked if he was using a cleansing artifact. Chris then mentally thanked his father and answered that yes, it was all thanks to him. The Count asked if that had been taken from the secret vault, and Chris admitted that he sometimes had the habit of stealing a few things. But it wasn't just that piece of equipment he had taken that would be useful. He threw something into the air that exploded in dark energy. He commented that there was no way to dodge that. Right after, he threw a bomb that hit Melon directly. He thought those artifacts, bought with Grantel's money, were proving really effective. He called out for Melon to come out of the flames, saying he knew she was still alive. Melon came out of the fire already launching a strike with her sword, but Chris made a precise thrust right at her blade, causing the large sword to crack and shatter into pieces. The Count noted that he had used air corrosion, and Chris even boasted to his sister. Even with the sword broken, Melon was unharmed, and said this was really fun. She charged at Chris with only her fists. Marion commented that Melon had lost her mind and they needed to stop her immediately. Chris, using his dark energy, easily stopped her punch, redirected it, and with a single move, subdued her using his sword. He said it looked like his victory, unless she still wasn't satisfied. The Count was extremely proud of his son. Melon laughed loudly and asked if he was really asking that. Chris took the opportunity to request a quick answer regarding the previous offer. Even though he had won, he said he would respect it if she didn't want to fulfill the condition, as loyalty, for him, didn't mean forcing anyone. Melon asked if staying by his side meant she would have to fight like that, and Chris replied only if she wanted to. Later, Marion was reflecting on everything she had witnessed. Seeing Chris control dark energy like that reminded her of the Elder throwing that same sword away and saying it rejected him. Marion wondered if it was impossible even for the Elder, but he explained he could use it momentarily, since the waves of dark energy changed constantly. That meant it was necessary to constantly adapt those waves so the sword wouldn't detect the user. But who could do that during a battle? Maybe only a demon from Gehenna or a draconic demon. If it wasn't one of those, the only way was someone who could control dark energy as naturally as breathing. After the fight, Chris asked Marion how he did, and she replied that maybe the Elder's wish for the clan could come true. At another moment, already in the castle's kitchen, the orcs were fiercely cutting strawberries to prepare a cake. Chris watched, surprised, and commented that he could hardly believe they were making strawberry shortcakes. Marie replied that, aside from appearances, they were actually quite delicate. The head chef asked what brought the young master there. Chris replied that he wanted to make some cookies. Marie wanted to know why, and Chris said it was to give as a gift. Marie, a little jealous, commented that it must be for another woman who wasn't her. Chris replied that it wasn't like that. The chef said he could make the cookies if he wanted, but Chris remarked that it didn't seem fun to do it alone. Suddenly, a piece of strawberry flew into his face because of how forcefully the orcs were cutting. He even wondered if it was real blood. Later, Chris went to meet Marion, who was already about to leave. She wanted to know what he wanted. Chris said he heard she was going away, so he came to say goodbye and also bring a small gift. Marion asked if they were cookies and said he didn't have to do that. Chris replied that he was happy to see her again, and that's why he made the sweets. The Count, watching, thought thought it now made sense that Chris had asked earlier about her favorite foods. He really knew how to win someone over. Chris said he had made the cookies himself and asked her to try one. Marion, surprised, tasted them and thought they were delicious. She said they were really good and Chris was happy she liked them. Marion then said he must want something in return for the gift and asked what it was. Chris replied that all he wanted was for her to be his true aunt from now on. Marion thought that since he mentioned blood denial, there must be a deeper meaning to it. She realized he wanted to take part in the sacred rite and was seeking her support in the upcoming succession conflict. Unfortunately, Marion said she might not be able to guarantee that. As he well knew, the adults of the main family were supposed to remain impartial among the candidates. That was the rule. Chris said it wasn't because of that, he just wanted to get closer to his aunt. Marion realized he really didn't have any other intentions, but Chris commented that if she wanted to help him in secret, he wouldn't refuse. He looked at her in silence. Marion then said she liked his honesty. After all, her nephew had made such delicious cookies for her. She couldn't just abandon him, but in return, he would have to make more cookies for her. Chris replied that it would depend on the help. If they made him sad, maybe he wouldn't even be able to recreate that same cookie flavor. Marion simply smiled slightly and asked what Christian would think about joining the Black Knights. She considered him exceptional in the duel against Melon, perhaps the best disciple the clan had ever had. However, his rivals and opponents wouldn't be easy to defeat. She was worried that he might waste his talent and not bloom in the right way. Chris replied that he would climb to the top of this path, even if he died along the way. He thanked his aunt for the concern, but said he wouldn't lose. Marion thought to herself about his confidence, but she understood that since he was a demon, she couldn't stop him from walking that bloody path. Still, she decided to give him a small piece of advice and told him to keep an eye on the steps of the young mistress. The Count asked if she was referring to Julianne, Eshid's sister, and remarked that she seemed to be the kindest of them all. Marion said he would soon understand why she mentioned that. Chris sincerely thanked her for the advice and promised he would take it into consideration. Marion said goodbye, saying she would see her nephew soon. Later, Chris was in his room just thinking. He thought that his father and aunt were incredibly powerful, both with 6 stars, but he had never heard their war stories. How many battles had they fought for the magic empire? There must have been forces capable of suppressing even the power of light. But he didn't want his past to repeat itself. He needed to get stronger. 1 month later, he was summoned by his father to the office. The Count said he had something very important to tell him, but he was also thinking about how much his son had evolved in such a short time. Chris asked why the surprise, since he had promised he would grow. Then he asked what the urgent matter was. The Count said he had received a letter from the main family. He had tried to enroll both Chris and Thorne in the sacred rite, but only Thorne was approved. The reason was Chris's record: reckless spending, lust with women, destruction while drunk, and theft. All of it was true, and there was no way to deny it. Even so, the Count was outraged that they underestimated his son. Chris asked if it was Viscount Langham who made the decision, but the Count said he hadn't spoken much since what happened with Eshid. In fact, the one who made the decision was Loan de Baron, a direct descendant of the main family and the promised star of the next sacred ritual. The dark rite consisted of absorbing pure darkness from the negative dimension. Since this darkness was limited, candidates fought almost to the death to define the hierarchy. Those with higher rankings received more darkness, which directly influenced the choice of the next successor. If Loin won and monopolized the darkness, he would easily become the 6th young master. The Count asked Chris not to worry, as he would try to talk again with the responsible elders and, if necessary, ask for Marion's help. Chris, however, refused. He said he would solve everything on his own. The Count acknowledged that his son had changed and was showing great talent, but still offered to handle the matter. Chris was moved by his father's words, but replied that he had his own methods. He then asked if any of the sons from Count Tiramin's house were among the ritual participants. The Count confirmed that the 3rd son was there and mentioned that Scoundrel had allied with Loin. Chris reassured his father, saying he would prove his worth. He knew the Tiramin family would soon organize a black pill hunt, and he planned to take part in it. Meanwhile, at the main family's headquarters, Marion returned to report on Christian. She said he was incomparable to the others. The elder, however, was doubtful, saying that Brat thought he was a genius, when in reality, he was just a false prodigy. But Marion insisted, stating that he was clearly different now. The elder commented that in that case, he believed Chris might fulfill the wish he had carried for a long time. Marion thought that this wish was what kept her father alive. He refused to die, sustaining himself through magic, just to achieve that goal. She replied that she wasn't sure, but maybe Chris was closer to that ideal than ever before. The elder found that interesting and sufficient. He asked Marion to continue observing Chris closely. He asked if Chris had been confirmed in the sacred ritual, and Marion Marion replied no. The elder asked if she would intervene, but she said she couldn't get involved in something so trivial. How could a self-proclaimed genius not be approved in a simple trial? Marion argued that, although he was a child, it was the adults who needed to give him the opportunity. If no one wanted to, he simply wouldn't stand a chance. The elder stared at her in silence for a moment. Marion lowered her head, thinking he had always been strict, but he was a man driven by expectations. The elder concluded by saying that if she was willing to go so far for that boy, then it must mean she truly liked him. Then the elder called his trusted subordinate, his blood drinker. This was Simon, the head butler of the Black Magic clan. Simon asked if his lord had called for him, and the elder confirmed it, asking if he had heard the entire conversation. Simon replied yes, and the elder said he only needed to keep watch over the boy. That was exactly what he wanted. He asked him to follow the proper path so Chris could enter the sacred rite. Simon obeyed as always, but asked for permission to play a small prank. The elder told him not to overdo it. Simon smiled and said he would do as desired. Marion, however, looked visibly worried because she wanted that brat to be safe. Later in the city, Chris was riding in his carriage. He thought he had reached the second star quickly thanks to his talent, but despite his training, his dark energy reserve was still very small. He couldn't reach the third star in his current state. He needed the black pill, which accumulated a large amount of dark energy all at once. The Tiraman family, who owned the black pill hunt, started getting involved with him. That actually was a stroke of luck. The problem was that, in order to obtain the pill, he would have to face the demonic beast Karajoff, as well as fulfill a special condition. Grantel arrived to receive Chris and asked the reason for the visit. Chris was direct and asked if he had brought something. Grantel said yes, that he had brought a gift, but Chris dropped the bag of coins on the ground and complained that this pathetic gift was worthless. He said he had heard about certain illegal activities Grantel was involved in, like tax evasion from the casino. Grantel asked what Chris wanted from him. Chris explained that if he didn't obey, he would shut down all those activities. He needed Grantel to locate a certain pill. Grantel understood and said that it had appeared on the black market. Chris confirmed that was exactly the right path. He then asked if Marie was ready for the task. Marie answered that her torture skills were nice and sharp. Poor Grantel was already so scared he had nearly soiled himself and promised to search for the pill. Chris commented that it was much easier when he cooperated. Before leaving, Chris also asked for a dagger capable of cutting through armor. Inwardly, Grantel cursed the boy. Later, Marie asked if they were going home, but Chris replied that there was still one place to visit. When they reached the right spot, he asked the coachman to stop. He entered a shop, looked around, and picked out several items. Marie asked what those objects were, and Chris replied that they had a specific use. Curious, she wanted to know why he was buying an aphrodisiac. The silence that followed was extremely awkward. Marie asked if it was for that, and Chris replied that it wasn't for him, but for someone else to use. She asked if it was for the Count, and Chris replied that considering his father's age, it might be useful. In the end, he told the shopkeeper it was a state secret. The shopkeeper assured him he would be discreet. The next morning, Chris met with his father and brother. Chris asked if Thorne had referred to him as brother. Thorne answered in a formal tone, calling him Honorable Your Majesty brother. He said he heard the black pill hunt was very dangerous and asked Chris not to get hurt. Chris asked if he was worried about his little brother, and Thorne replied that it wasn't that. He just didn't want Chris to die before their next duel. The Count interrupted, saying that was enough of the brotherly bickering, and asked Chris to be careful at the Tiraman estate. Chris replied that everything was already planned and he would bring good news. The father, curious, asked Thorne what that Your Majesty thing was about. Thorne said their father didn't need to know. Later at Count Tiraman's estate, the butler announced once again that they were not authorized to enter. One of Chris's attendants protested, asking how they dared make the young master wait and whether they even knew who he was. The Tiraman house butler responded that it was a direct order and that they owed no courtesy to a bastard like him. Chris warned them to watch their words because they wouldn't be getting any accommodation there. The butler from Chris's household suggested bringing the family head immediately, but Chris asked how much he would need to pay to get a room. The butler said he could send the bill to Lord Tiramin. Later, they were already in an extremely luxurious mansion. The butler asked how much it had cost. Chris replied that it was at least 150,000 rupias and commented that money was meant to be spent anyway. He ordered them to organize all the luggage within an hour, and then they would go drink a bit. Suddenly, Marie popped out of a suitcase. She said the mansion was beautiful. Surprised, Chris asked why she was there. Marie explained that she had hidden inside the luggage because she had promised to be his maid forever. She loved seeing him embarrassed like that. That's when a new voice interrupted them, asking what this bill was about. It was a lawyer Alois, the third son of Count Tyraman. Chris commented that here was the protagonist of the Black Pill hunt. He said he had just been looking for a place to sleep, and of course, someone so honorable and proud like him wouldn't stay in just any hotel. That's why he rented that mansion. He asked if there was a problem, considering that Count Tyraman didn't even welcome his guests. He said the price might serve as a lesson in proper manners. Alois was furious and summoned his beast. He called forth a demonic jaguar and asked if Chris wanted to die. Chris thought that was the famous subjugation technique from the Tyraman family. Unlike taming arts, dark magic could control demonic beasts through force. The formula he used was far more advanced than any common taming technique. The intent to mentally dominate the beast was clear. Chris understood he needed to teach Alois a lesson for now. Looking at the summoned beast, he sarcastically commented that this scary little kitty seemed way too dangerous, and that, in that case, he would probably need a weapon. Marie handed Chris only a wooden stick that looked more like a broom handle. Not understanding, Chris asked if he was really supposed to attack with that, but Alois reacted with irritation, telling him to stop mocking. Then he unleashed his demonic beast to kill Chris, who tried to defend himself with the stick. However, the creature broke the wood easily and threw Chris far away. Even injured, Chris commented that 2 against 1 was unfair. He said if this were a real fight, he should at least have some advantage. Alois, irritated, called him arrogant and promised to make him kneel before his beast. He attacked with the intent to kill, certain he had landed the blow. But in the next moment, he realized Chris was no longer there. With an improvised staff in hand, Chris appeared beside him and began striking Alois's head repeatedly. The impact of the blows took him by surprise, and Chris warned him that even if it hurt, he wouldn't go easy. Furious, Alois told him to shut up. However, both he and the demonic beast began to feel an extremely intimidating aura emanating from Chris. The creature was so frightened that it ran off and hid. Confused, Alois asked what Chris had done to his beast. He replied that he had used a simple second star illusion, and commented that Alois's subjugation methods weren't as powerful as he thought. Outraged, Alois declared that Chris was a disgrace as a young master and vowed to prove otherwise, preparing to summon another beast. Before he could finish, Chris asked if he knew what kind of ability someone like him had. Then, without hesitation, he hurled the staff directly at Alois's head, knocking him unconscious. Chris remarked that his main trait was never waiting for the enemy's preparations or transformations. Meanwhile, a small horse that had been trapped was trying to escape. Later, Chris was once again involved in gambling. The butler asked if he was sure about what he was doing, and Chris replied that he had free time. The butler, however, said he wasn't exactly resting. Chris responded sarcastically, saying he was a useless bastard as everyone claimed, and that he had little left besides spending money. Marie appeared, agreeing with him, and brought a non-alcoholic drink. Frustrated, Chris thought he wanted alcohol, not some random juice. The butlers of the Tyraman household, keeping a close eye on him, watched from afar. Noticing them, Chris taunted them, asking why they didn't join the table, since Alois wouldn't be waking up anytime soon after the beating he had taken. The provocation irritated the butlers, who spent the rest of the day watching him. By nightfall, Chris was already quite drunk, as were his own servants. The butlers decided to report everything in a written statement, but Chris was only pretending to be drunk. Suddenly, he stood up, knowing he had already delayed a bit. He told Marie he needed to go somewhere quickly and asked her not to follow him. Marie, annoyed, asked if he had the aphrodisiac, hinting that he intended to use it alone. She was sad that she couldn't do anything for him, but said she would celebrate if he managed to seduce some women. Irritated, Chris told her to be quiet. Later, in the Kaiton Mountains, Chris reflected on that secret place within the Tyraman lands. The energy of demonic beasts was intense, and he quickly crossed the forest until he found the Tyraman's secret training center. He thought there were only 2 guards, and was glad he had learned the invisibility spell from Marie, although she always took the topic in another direction. With this spell, he passed by the guards unnoticed and entered the training center. Inside the place, he found a kind of altar. He recognized it as the altar where the black pill of the hunt was kept, as Eri had mentioned in his past life. However, to obtain the pill, Karajov had to willingly offer his own life. This would only happen if he were completely terrified, especially by things with divine energy, to which he was extremely sensitive. When that happened, the gray pill would transform into the black pill. The Tyraman family, experts in subjugating demonic beasts through fear, controlled the hunt and the pill's production. Chris remembered that Lena had said he planned to steal this technique, but he didn't have enough time to learn everything. He considered using the aphrodisiac to confuse Karajov and steal the pill for himself. However, he felt a presence. He thought someone had seen him, but when he looked back, there was no one. Even so, he continued on his way. Upon entering the cave, he was overwhelmed by such strong evil energy that he felt exhausted. A high high-level dark magic barrier protected the place. At the back of the cave was a rift that led to Gehenna, the world of demons. He was shocked to see something so dangerous right before his eyes. He thought that if he could lure Karajov to that rift and use a good bait, he might have a real chance in the hunt. However, he wasn't the only one watching. A bat observed from afar? It was Simon, who had been keeping an eye on him. Simon commented to himself that he hadn't expected that brat to be so interesting. Not only had he defeated the Tiraman boy, but he had also found the secret area and was plotting something. That only made Simon more excited to play a trick on him. After thinking carefully, Chris approached the Gehenna rift and placed his hand on it, making a blood pact. The portal responded, asking what his desire was. The next morning, all preparations for the Black Pill hunt were complete. Chris noticed that Alois was pretending to be confident, even after the beating he had taken. When he commented on this, Alois told him to shut up. Chris realized he was just a poser, since he couldn't even properly use the grenade weapon, despite having brought it. Even so, Chris remarked that it was more effective than the simple staff he was using, and suggested he try it out to see the difference. Lena interrupted, saying everyone was ready, and it was time to take Karajov to the altar. For that, the members responsible for guarding should accompany him. Chris noticed the presence of a strange bat nearby, but said nothing. When Alois asked if he had understood the instructions, Chris responded with indifference that he had. Later, at the altar, one of the guards suggested that Chris move away, as he was interfering with the hunt. He agreed, but warned that there would be no use crying and asking for help when everything went wrong. The comment irritated the guard, but Alois told him to focus, as the hunt was about to begin. Since he had been assigned to the rear guard, Chris ended up bored. Even so, he knew they would all fall into his trap. With him were the special dagger and the pill that Grantel had provided. When they heard a noise from the forest, Chris realized that Karajov, the 4th-level demonic beast, was approaching. However, he noticed that the monster seemed different, more unstable. The guard then asked Alois to begin the subjugation art. When the spell was cast, other guards approached to restrain the beast. Karajov came slowly, as if sniffing something in the air, but suddenly became extremely enraged and attacked violently. Caught off guard, Alois was hit immediately. The nearby guard couldn't do anything. The creature began releasing poison into the air, forcing the guards to create a defensive barrier around Alois. Chris realized that everything had gone out of control. The aphrodisiac he had used on Karajov had taken effect, making the creature even more unpredictable. Although Alois said they had an antidote, he admitted that the fight at that point was extremely dangerous. The guards did their best, but were easily defeated. When Alois was about to be crushed, Chris intervened, protecting him at the last moment. He remarked that it was pathetic to see a Tiraman fail at a subjugation, and provocatively said he would let Alois call him Big Brother. Alois, irritated, asked what Chris intended to do in that situation, considering his own guards were injured. With no other option, he admitted that he needed help and asked for Chris's support, who replied that he should fulfill the promise he had made. With that, Chris advanced and delivered a powerful blow to Karajov's face, followed by the use of the subjugation art. Unlike Alois, Chris's technique was successful. Surprised, Alois asked how he could use a technique like that, being just a troublesome bumpkin. Chris, in turn, thought that since the technique wasn't a secret, it was enough to study the intermediate level to master it. In this way, he managed to subdue Karajov easily, chaining him and riding him like a wild horse. Desperate, Alois shouted for him to stop and asked where he was taking the creature. Chris, with everything under control, led it into the cave. Upon entering, Karajov reacted to the intense evil energy of the place. Chris spoke to the creature as if it were the first time it was seeing the malice of Gehenna, and said it should feel fear. Karajov entered a trance before that demonic aura, and Chris, taking advantage of the moment, placed his dagger against the beast's neck. Later, when the others arrived, Alois questioned what he was doing inside, claiming that the cave was extremely dangerous and they needed to leave immediately. Chris mocked his fear, but noticed that the ash pill still hadn't transformed into the black pill. The other guards complained, saying he had ruined everything. However, Alois asked them to let the matter go. He sincerely thanked Chris for saving his subordinates, saying that they had only avoided more serious injuries because of him. Faced with that, Chris felt a pang of guilt, as he knew he had stolen the real black pill and hidden it. Even so, he demanded that Alois call him Big Brother, but he refused, saying he was 2 years older. Suddenly, a strong tremor shook the cave. Alois' subordinates felt a crushing demonic pressure. Alois, frightened, asked what was happening. Soon after, everyone saw a massive demonic creature appear before them. The demon, with a deep voice, said it had been a long time since it had any fun. Chris immediately recognized what it was, a war demon. Panicked, Alois declared it was an intruder and said he would deal with it personally. quickly. Chris noticed a strange bat nearby and without hesitation threw a dagger at it. That bat was, in fact, the medium Simon was using to spy on the situation, but the transmission was cut off by the attack. Simon realized that Chris had discovered the plan. Initially, he intended to act against the demon later, but now he understood that, with the interruption, the seal would only cease in at least 5 minutes. If he arrived too late, everyone would die. With no choice, he rushed toward the cave. Meanwhile, the demon mocked Chris's behavior, saying he seemed too confident for someone about to die. Chris, trying to stay composed, replied that he had only gotten rid of unwanted eyes, but he knew that enemy was dangerous. He assessed it as a low-class demon when compared to those from the region of destruction, but still powerful, at least equivalent to a 5-star opponent. Chris knew it was not an enemy he could face directly at that moment. Using a spell, Chris put Alois's subordinates to sleep. Alois, confused, tried to understand what was happening, but before he could react, Chris knocked him out with a punch, taking advantage of the fact that he was resistant to magic, but not to physical attacks. The demon, observing everything, asked if Chris was offering the others as a sacrifice. It said it would spare him if he fled immediately. However, Chris was not willing to run. He admitted he was not a man of many principles, nor an ally of those present, but even so, he was not the type to abandon others. The demon belittled Chris, saying that the grenade sword, no matter how powerful, would be useless in the hands of someone like him. Then, it launched a powerful demonic energy attack. Chris tried to defend himself, but the blow was too strong. He spat blood and was easily captured by the enemy. Even at a disadvantage, Chris reacted by spitting in the demon's face, which enraged it even more. At that moment, Chris asked who said he couldn't use a sacred sword. With that, he broke free from the Gehenna demon's grip and activated the power of the black pill, causing his sword to grow. That was the true form of grenade. The demon was surprised to see a demonic human manipulating the power of light. Chris, confident, asked if it was afraid. The demon denied it, claiming it would finish the fight quickly. However, Chris wielded grenade and used the light technique that had once split the Dead Sea. The light attack completely destroyed the demonic blow, opening a massive rift and slicing the demon in half. The creature, shocked, was sent back through the portal from which it had come. After that, Chris, exhausted from the effort, collapsed unconscious. As he blacked out, he remembered the conversation he had with the hero, Evan, who had asked if he had managed to replicate the legendary light technique that split the Dead Sea. Chris had confirmed, still in disbelief. Evan said the technique literally meant a single strike of light capable of splitting the entire sea, and that despite mastering it, he himself had failed to join the clan of light. But he believed Chris would succeed. That would be the light capable of saving the world. Meanwhile, someone was observing all of Chris's memories with interest. When the healers arrived, a woman introduced herself as Mafina, the first of the 7 thrones of the kingdom of Gehenna. She declared that she would await Chris's future actions. Sometime later, at the Tiramin family mansion, Chris woke up. He thought to himself that he had been asleep for 2 days but felt that his body was fine. He checked his pouch and was relieved to find the black pill intact. However, he questioned who that Mafina was. Why had she taken an interest in him? Chris knew that sometimes demonic humans received blessings from demons, but that usually happened to people of dubious nature. Still, that demon didn't seem so powerful. Soon the door opened. Count Tiramin and his son entered. The Count asked about Chris's health, and Chris stood up to bow. The Count kindly asked him to stay at ease and said that the day before, he had sent a squad to investigate the cave. They discovered that the magic circle surrounding the portal to Gehenna had been reversed for some reason. During a brief moment, blood had spilled from the seal, and that was enough to kill everyone who was present. Chris reflected on the matter and concluded that someone had interfered with the seal. Count Tiramin then apologized. He admitted that Chris had not been treated properly by the house servants, nor had he received the attention he deserved. He bowed before him, recognizing him as the benefactor of the Tiramin family. Not wanting to be exalted, Chris replied that everyone there belonged to the Black Magic clan. He had only done what was necessary. In the end, they were all part of the same family. The Count agreed. He said that if Chris needed help with anything, he just had to ask. As long as it wasn't something impossible, he would do his best to help. Chris then made a request. He wanted the Tiramin house to let go of the old feuds with House Khazar, which until then had maintained a rivalry rooted in mutual hostility. He wished for a relationship that was more friendly yet still competitive, something worthy of families that shared the same blood. He believed the Count knew this as well. The root of the fights between the houses lay in the manipulations of the main clan, which felt threatened when the branch families united. Tiramin asked if Chris wanted to start a revolt against the main family, but Chris made it clear he had no such thoughts. He only believed it was wrong to be forced to to obey something due to a mistake they didn't even commit. For the first time in many years, Tyraman commented that he would reach out to that damn Ridden, that fool. Chris saw it as something positive, since the union between them could result in a solid alliance during the era of destruction. Meanwhile, Chin questioned why Tyraman's son was just watching from afar. He said he needed to give his cousin a message. Alois then handed Chris a pill. It was the ash pill. He explained that when he woke up, the pill was on the ground completely covered in blood, and since Chris was still unconscious, he decided to keep it for him. Chris, with a touch of irony, said that if Alois was so grateful, he could give him a little more. Alois cursed under his breath but laughed at the provocation. Soon after, Amin also said he owed Chris a gift and gave him a summoning stone, capable of summoning demonic beasts up to rank 4. Chris was surprised, as it was an incredibly rare item. Jeremy said he would write a report so Chris could participate in the sacred rite, and wished him good results. Chris thanked everyone for their help. As he left the room, Tyramin told him to get some rest. Chris was truly happy in that moment. But then, sensing a presence, he asked if the hidden visitor didn't intend to come out. From the shadows behind the curtain, Simon emerged, saying he had not been discovered by chance. He had managed to hide from Tyramin, but not from Chris. Chris replied that he had recognized the smell of blood. Simon introduced himself as the chief butler of the Black Magic clan. Chris was immediately on alert. He knew that name. He thought Simon was the leader of the Blood Shadow Mages, a separate psychotic organization that made no distinction between the Magic Empire and the Domain of Light. They delighted in slaughter. The leader of the Shadow Mages was a demon who had reached 8 stars, and by the end of the era of destruction, rose to 9, becoming one of the 10 demon kings. Chris couldn't even count how many times he had nearly died because of Simon. Not to mention that his body and flesh had been used by the King of Carnage. Impressed, Simon commented that he never imagined the young master of House Khazar would be so incredible. He also found it surprising that he had eliminated a demon from Gehenna. Chris thought he had only destroyed the demon's clone, so he became suspicious. Perhaps Simon had seen the light that cut through the Dead Sea. Chris tried to deflect, saying he had no idea what Simon was talking about. Simon laughed and accused him of pretending to be a fool. After the battle in the cave, the demon's body had been completely vaporized, leaving no trace. It wasn't just a reverse summoning. That's why he was so impressed. He asked Chris to explain how he managed to annihilate the enemy like that, and warned that everything he said would be reported to the clan elder. Chris, however, refused to give any explanation. He said that if he were in the elder's position, he would prefer a predator that hid its claws until the right moment. Intrigued, Simon said he was truly an interesting person. Chris took the opportunity to ask if he shouldn't at least apologize for the false accusation. After all, it was hard to distinguish a reverse summoning from a complete annihilation based on evidence alone. That was why Count Tyraman had misinterpreted the situation. But there was one detail only Simon knew. The real reason he was sure it was total annihilation. It was simple, because he was the one who had performed the summoning. Simon admitted he would take responsibility. But Chris said he wouldn't reveal the secret under one condition. Simon owed him a favor. When Simon asked if that was a deal, Chris confirmed. Simon then promised he would not forget that mercy, and wished him a good day, saying he would count the days until he reached the main clan. Chris reflected. Simon was an extremely important figure during the era of destruction. Building good connections was essential if he wanted to change the fate of humanity. Later, Marie was preparing to return home, but Alois showed up to speak briefly with Chris. He asked if he was already leaving. Chris replied that a promise was a promise, so he had to use his title. Being older, Alois laughed, but said he had a warning for him. He mentioned that despite saying they were all family, he didn't think what they were doing to Chris was fair. He said Chris probably already knew this, but one of the favorites for the sacred rite was the young master Loin. Even with only 2 stars, he belonged to the main family, which had better elixirs, superior techniques, blessings, and dark magic. They were born with a silver spoon. Chris, however, smiled. Instead of feeling down, he said he would give his little brother some advice. Not to participate in the sacred rite this year. He said it for his own good. Alois firmly stated that he would never let Chris monopolize all the dark energy. But Chris only warned him to pay close attention, because any opponent who dared face him in the sacred rite would certainly regret it. He then called Marie and said it was time to go, leaving Alois with one final recommendation: to think carefully, so he wouldn't regret it later. Later, at Count Khazar's estate, Thorne asked one of the servants if his brother had resumed training right after his return. The servant confirmed that he had, saying Chris was training intensely for the sacred rite. Upon meeting Chris again, Thorne greeted him with sarcasm, calling him honorable majesty brother, and reminded him of the duel they had promised each other. Chris noticed how much his brother had grown in a short time, and thought he was probably already halfway through the second star stage. However, he was busy and didn't want to fight at that moment. He also suspected Thorne wanted to join the sacred rite, so he suggested they train after he finished his own exercises. Thorne, impatient, insisted he didn't want to postpone it, saying the fight would be different this time and warned Chris to be careful. Without much desire, Chris gave in and told him to get on with it. That moment reminded him of someone from his past, since promises always brought him back to certain memories. Later, while contemplating the black pill, he reflected that there was still a month left before the sacred rite. With conviction, he bit into the pill, even though the taste was extremely bitter. He focused on absorbing the dark energy flowing within it, but noticed it was more turbulent than he expected. Besides dark energy, he also sensed a divine force, perhaps linked to light energy. He thought this might be a result of what Karajov had experienced inside. He understood why the pill was so difficult to absorb, but decided it didn't matter. He focused even more, determined to use the light energy to help him. Although it was difficult for demonic humans to deal with light, Chris was an exception, as he possessed both types of energy. He directed all that force to his light core, and with that, managed to root the dark energy into his body. His core then stabilized. Meanwhile, in a distant place, an important figure summoned his subordinate, who brought a report on the investigation ordered during the Black Pill hunt. He explained there had been an incident where a demon from Gehenna was summoned, but the involved parties had survived. He apologized for the delay and said that if there were no further questions, he would take his leave. That investigation naturally was about Chris, and the person behind everything was Lady. 15 days later, Thorne knocked on Chris's door, saying it was the promised day. Chris let him in and was still getting dressed. Thorne was shocked by the powerful aura his brother radiated. Chris commented that this was the first thing Thorne did in the morning, hinting he was afraid of being surpassed. Thorne, still surprised by Chris's overwhelming presence, tried to hide it, but soon replied that he wouldn't be intimidated. He said he wanted to face him right away, and Chris accepted the challenge with one condition. If he won, Thorne would have to give up on the sacred rite. Taken aback, Thorne asked why, and Chris explained that the rite was a serious competition, and he didn't want to see weaklings participating. When Thorne insisted, Chris said he was only trying to show brotherly concern, but that the lesson would have to be physical since words weren't enough. Thorne charged at him in anger, but the difference in power was obvious. After the fight, he was completely bandaged and in a cast. Count Khazar scolded Chris, saying he had gone too far and that because of this, Thorne would have to spend at least half a month in bed, with no chance to participate in the rite. Chris asked for permission to speak with his brother, and the Count allowed it. Alone, Chris approached Thorne, who was in a bad mood, and asked why he was sulking. He told him to stop acting like a crybaby since he had asked for the fight. Thorne, resentful, asked if his older brother didn't like seeing his progress. He constantly felt overshadowed by Chris's achievements and believed he had hurt him on purpose. Seeing his brother's sadness, Chris noticed he was on the verge of tears. He explained that maybe they were on different pages, but his true wish was to see him grow stronger, so they could fight side by side someday. He said that if Thorne competed now in the sacred rite, he would miss the opportunity to properly absorb dark energy. That's why he had been harsh, because he knew his brother was stubborn. More importantly, that type of energy wasn't even compatible with Thorne. Chris had realized that the energy best suited to his brother's body was gray energy. He explained that just like light energy has different types, the same applies to dark energy. Pure dark energy is the most powerful, but just below it is dark gray energy, ideal for curse magic. When Thorne asked how he knew that, Chris simply said he had realized it during the fight. Since he had used his full power, he thought to himself that he couldn't reveal he came from the future. He explained that if his brother absorbed pure dark energy before gray energy, he would have a hard time mastering it later. It wouldn't make the process impossible, but it would limit its special properties and slow his development. Chris emphasized that he just wanted his brother to grow strong as quickly as possible. He asked him to reconsider joining the rite, saying it was sincere advice from an older brother who wanted to see his younger sibling grow. He then handed him the ash pill. Thorne, surprised, asked why he was receiving something so valuable. Chris simply replied that he was his little brother, and that was the best reason there could be. Thorne was visibly moved as he held the gift. With a sad look, he asked why, if Chris was capable of changing so much now, he had behaved like such a complete fool even when their mother was on her deathbed. He said he knew how much she had suffered because of him. Chris remained silent for a few moments, and with regret, replied that he simply hadn't understood at the time. A few days later, already traveling for the sacred rite, Chris complained about the long journey. He said he needed to stretch, as his body was sore. He thought it was absurd how difficult it was to open the gates, and even considered that the main family was being petty. He reflected on when they became heads of the clan, and how things had changed. Meanwhile, Marie seemed excited about the trip. She enthusiastically commented that it was a private outing for just the two of them, and that her heart was pounding. Chris, on the other hand, reminded her that she didn't even have a real heart, as she was bound to him by a spiritual pact. The main family had limited Chris to bringing only one companion on the journey. Naturally, he chose Marie, since she was tied to him by contract and couldn't be far from him. The coachman, loyal to the young master, encouraged Chris to teach the main family a good lesson. During their arrival, some people were already whispering about his presence, commenting on his growing reputation. Chris's notoriety was spreading. Meanwhile, Marie observed the reactions around them and commented that he was becoming famous. Suddenly, the conversation stopped, and everyone's attention turned to a figure approaching. To everyone's surprise, it was the chief butler, Simon, who was heading straight toward Chris. His presence caused astonishment. People wondered why someone so important was speaking with someone who had once been considered nothing more than a weakling of the family. Simon praised Chris's progress, saying he had grown a lot in just 1 month. Chris, suspicious, asked if the butler didn't have anything better to do. Simon, with his usual smile, explained that he was there under direct orders from the elder of the clan. He said the old man wanted to meet him personally. When he noticed Chris didn't seem surprised, he commented on it. Chris, with restrained irony, replied that he was indeed surprised. Later in the throne room, Simon announced the arrival of the young master. The elder slowly turned and said it had been a long time since he had last seen Christian. The moment Chris felt the pressure of the energy emanating from the old man, he almost fainted. That dominant presence was suffocating, difficult even for veterans to endure. Even so, Chris stood firm, remained upright, and bowed in respect to the leader of the Black Magic clan. The elder asked why he was no longer surprised by that meeting. Chris replied that he had already expected something like that. After all, he was the new star that had emerged in the clan. The elder agreed. He said Marion and Simon had not held back their praise when speaking of him. However, he revealed that he had summoned him because he still had doubts about whether he should truly place so many expectations on someone like him. He explained that to him it didn't matter how good a seed was. What truly mattered was the kind of fruit it would bear in the future. Chris acknowledged the wisdom of those words and said he was still far from meeting such expectations. The elder asked if he believed he would one day meet them, but Chris preferred to be realistic. He said only time could tell if a simple sprout could grow into a great tree, but he assured that even if he failed to exceed expectations, he would never disappoint the clan. In response, the elder said he was satisfied and that from that moment on he would place his hopes in Chris. He then dismissed him. Later, Marion asked the elder what he thought of Chris. The old master replied that the young man had surpassed his expectations, but he also stated that because he was such a rare talent, his destiny would be turbulent. He said Chris would face a long and bloody path before reaching the Magic Empire. However, he admitted that a hope had blossomed in his heart. Perhaps that boy was indeed the child destined to fulfill his old wish. On the eve of the sacred rite, the name of Christian van Baron Kazar, the eldest son of Count Kazar, was formally announced. Many were shocked, questioning why a fool like him had been called. Chris, used to the comments, simply thought it was natural. After all, he was simply amazing, and that irritated others. While observing the hall, a waitress passed near him with a tray. Chris, suspicious, looked at the glass and thought it was an alcoholic drink. When he asked, the waitress confirmed and said that since he was still underage, he couldn't drink. She offered him a ginger soda as an alternative. Both she and Marie laughed at the situation, and Chris, irritated, thought to himself how much he hated Ginger, calling them damn demons. Soon after, the arrival of the young masters was announced. A line of refined heirs entered the hall with great pomp. Eschid de Baron, the second young master, appeared first, followed by Julianne de Baron, the first young master. Then came Jupian de Baron, the second young mistress, and Mysak de Baron, the third. Chris watched everything closely. He noticed that the first young master, that madman, didn't seem to be present. He wondered what Eschid, his failed victim, would do in his presence. When Eschid passed by Chris, he completely ignored him. Chris was irritated. He thought the other hadn't even looked at him and mentally called him a bastard. To him, Eschid was nothing more than an ant. Then Julianne also walked past him without saying anything. That reminded him of his aunt's warning, who had told him she was the most dangerous. Chris didn't feel anything strange at first glance, but realized he would later understand why so much caution was necessary. Shortly after, someone approached Christian and introduced himself as Far, a subordinate of young Master Loin. Chris simply stared at him with distrust, waiting for what he would say next. 4 had heard rumors that an unworthy person would participate in the dark sacred ritual the next day. He was concerned that an unqualified participant could cause an accident, staining the name of the main clan. When he heard that, Chris asked if he was being considered unworthy for the ritual, and 4 replied that he simply had to prove himself worthy. Watching the conversation was Loin himself, and Chris thought that if he truly wanted to resolve this, he should have come personally. Chris remained calm and said the situation might seem inconvenient, but even so, he invited them to show what they could do. 4, however, claimed he was unarmed. Chris then questioned whether he really believed weapons were necessary to face a butler. Fury, trying to intimidate him, said he would regret this, but Chris remained firm, stating that he regretted nothing. Julianne, for her part, observed everything with great attention. Later, everyone was in shock. The poor butler had been completely defeated by the spirits, while Chris received a loving massage from them. People wondered how that was possible. The summons had been performed by 4 himself, but it only took one look at Chris for him to take control. Now the spirits were pleasing him as if they were his servants. Faced with the scene, Chris asked sarcastically if that was to young Master Loin's liking. For him, all of that was unworthy of a direct descendant of the Black Magic clan. If he wanted to resolve something, he should challenge him to a real duel. However, Loin claimed the incident had nothing to do with him. Chris then replied that it clearly did, since the one involved was his personal servant. Finally, he stated that they would meet again at the sacred ritual. On the day of the dark sacred ritual, Chris was very sleepy. Alois approached and asked if he wasn't even a little nervous, reminding him that he had caused quite a stir the day before. Chris simply asked why he was there, since he had warned him. Alois replied that he would never miss the sacred ritual. At that moment, Loin appeared, and Chris thought to himself that that damn brat would get what he deserved. Shortly after, a man approached asking if everyone was present. His name was Sebastian, the deputy butler in charge of the main house. He would be responsible for guiding the participants to the ritual site. When he struck his scepter on the ground, a dimensional magic was activated, revealing stairs that, instead of going up, descended into what appeared to be an underground area. Some wondered if that was their destination, but Chris realized it was a newly materialized imaginary space. Sebastian descended as if it were the simplest thing in the world, making it clear that his speed was impressive. The others ran to keep up. Upon arriving in the imaginary space, everyone was confused. The place was so strange that it caused nausea, dizziness, and disorientation. Some people even drooled from discomfort. Apparently, the group was ascending and descending at the same time, as if trapped between dimensions. Sebastian warned that he would not wait forever. That was already the first test. Some people fell straight into the limbo of the imaginary space, while the rest became increasingly terrified. He insisted they were late and increased the pace even more. As a result, more people were eliminated. Loin, noticing this, thought the losers were being taken one by one and concluded that Chris must have fallen as well. However, Chris was the only one who remained calm, not even sweating. Loin could not understand how that was possible. Chris then asked sarcastically if he was already out of breath, and reflected on how shameful it was that a direct successor, raised with the best elixirs and foods, was in such a pitiful state. Chris concluded that the other fools were only there to suffer. For him, running inside that illusory space was pointless. No matter how much effort he used, his energy would not be depleted. That was because he had performed a reverse conjuration, making himself invincible in that environment. Sebastian seemed to notice something and thought that must be young Master Christian. Later, they finally arrived at the true location of the ritual. Only 4 people had made it through. Alois, surprised, asked how Chris was still intact, and he simply replied that Alois should have trained his body better. Then a magical crystal began to speak to the participants, welcoming them. It explained that they were in the sacred center, where pure dark energy was strongest. The region was called the Sacred Darkness, and the one greeting them was Rihu, the manager of the sacred space. She welcomed the young masters and explained the purpose of the day. The goal was simple: to obtain pure darkness, originated from the third demon king, the destroyer of darkness and progenitor of the Black Magic clan. Suddenly, a kind of magical arrow struck all of them, linking them to the ritual. From that moment, they would share the same energy, and a demonic beast would test whether they were worthy. Chris then asked if the evaluation was based on who arrived first. Ryu confirmed and praised his perception. He also asked what would happen in case of unexpected accidents between the competitors. Ryu explained that each would be on a separate path, and if they happened to meet, they should avoid conflict. The more time they lost, the better it would be for the others. Therefore, each one should stay focused and fight for their own safety. As the countdown ended, everyone immediately set off, running toward the beginning of the challenge. Ryu wished the competitors good luck and remained beside Sebastian, but the moment he turned to ask her something, he noticed that she had simply vanished. This irritated him deeply. He thought she was cold and unpredictable. Meanwhile, the corridors through which the participants advanced were lit by candles and chandeliers. In each of these paths, demonic beasts waited silently for intruders. On Loin's path, the creatures that appeared were hellhounds, but he dealt with them easily. In his mind, they were nothing more than second-tier monsters, no threat to someone like him, an advanced second-star cultivator. He believed Christian must have been in a much worse situation. According to the rules, all paths were supposed to have the same challenges and the same distance. However, Loin had bribed a mage to alter that. Only Chris's path was modified, becoming more dangerous, with much stronger creatures appearing by coincidence. To Loin, it was certain that Chris would meet his tragic end right there. Since death during the ritual was considered natural, that place would become his grave. After clearing his path with ease, Loin was the first to reach the end and was already preparing to declare victory, but he was surprised to find Chris already waiting. Chris commented ironically that Loin was late and asked why he had taken so long. He added that he thought Loin had died along the way. Not understanding what was happening, Loin asked how Chris had arrived so quickly, since his path should have been extremely difficult. Chris responded casually, implying that it had not taken much effort. Loin, suspicious, stated that his path had been deliberately altered and said he knew it was Chris's fault. When he asked what Chris was implying and who he thought he was, Chris replied that there was no need for formalities, since they were alone. The attitude irritated Loin, who called him arrogant. He also said it was taboo to fight other competitors during the ritual, but since Chris wanted it so badly, he would crush him right there. The fight began. Loin attacked with an explosive short-range magical technique designed to disable the opponent by directly affecting their joints. However, Chris dodged with speed and precision. He was well versed in the art of magical combat and was not hit by a single attack. Loin grew increasingly irritated, calling him slippery, like a damned rat. When he saw an opening in Chris's guard, he quickly advanced, believing he could break his arm, but it was all a trap. Chris grabbed him firmly and with a swift movement twisted Loin's arm, completely immobilizing him. The boy screamed in pain from the impact of the technique. Shortly afterward, Alois arrived running and asked if he had taken too long. He realized that both opponents were already out of combat. Chris had defeated them both with ease. He even commented, taunting, that Alois was slow. He also said that both adversaries had passed out on their own. Alois, suspicious, replied that Chris wouldn't have hesitated to run over them and concluded that he really had taken them down. At that moment, Chris remembered his past life. 5 years into the future, the first great alliance would break. He knew he needed the support of the Black Magic clan before that happened. That's why he refused to share the dark energy with the others. After finishing the confrontation, he opened the great doors that led to the center of the sacred darkness, the source of power capable of granting complete transcendence to a demon. In the clan's history, the Elder himself had only managed to absorb 80% of that darkness. One of the most powerful demon monarchs, known as the Shadow Destroyer, had reached 90%. If Chris could absorb 100%, he might surpass even the current Demon Emperor. With that goal in mind, he began to absorb all the dark energy available. Later, in a High Council meeting, it was declared that the situation was unbelievable. Everyone except Chris had been eliminated. Loin was in critical condition. Some speculated whether it had been a trick or the use of a magical tool. Others argued that an investigation should be conducted. However, Jupian intervened. To her, it was unnecessary. She said that bastard would never have been able to enter the sacred darkness. Since Chris hadn't emerged from the sacred ground after 2 days, the conclusion was that he had been crushed by the darkness itself and died. Jupian also stated that if even the Elder had absorbed only 80%, there was no way that bastard had survived. She stood up and declared that not even his corpse would remain. In her thoughts, she said that if by any chance Chris survived, she would kill him herself. To her, it was personal. When her father died in battle against the Alliance, she and Loin were adopted by their uncle, Viscount Langham. Since then, her position within the family had been unstable. Now that Loin had also failed to obtain the sacred darkness, he would have no support left. She decided she would make Christian pay for such humiliation. Meanwhile, the maids were gossiping about the fate of the bastard boy who was still inside. They believed he was already dead, punished for his greed. However, Marie, who had overheard everything, silently appeared behind them. Without them noticing, she healed the sack one of them was carrying, just to scare them. Then she said coldly that she didn't care about that kind of talk, but if they kept making noise about the young master, they would end up as ghosts, under the control of a banshee. The two maids fled in terror. Marie sighed, staring into the void, and silently asked her master to return soon. Leaving her waiting so long wasn't very kind to a mere maid. Meanwhile, Chris was still inside the sacred space, enduring immense pain. He felt as if he were being suffocated by the darkness. He estimated that he had already absorbed around 70% of that dark energy, which was much more difficult than he had imagined. Even so, he had to endure. The real pain, he knew, would begin after 90%. If he passed his limit, his spiritual core would shatter, and he would die before completing the absorption. That was when he remembered the draconic heart, a structure capable of storing much more energy than his core. If he could redirect the absorbed energy to that alternate heart, he might have a chance. Then, with effort and focus, he began to fill his heart with the sacred darkness. Suddenly, a voice asked if he needed help. It was Mefina, a demon. Surprised, Chris asked if a demon could appear there. Mefina explained that one of the natural powers of demons was precisely communication through darkness, and that it wasn't difficult for her to be present in that space. She also said she could help him without asking for anything in return. Suspicious, Chris wanted to know why she wasn't demanding compensation. Mefina replied that just feeling the darkness flowing from that place was already enough for her. She then asked him to take her hand and allow her to help channel that energy to complete the absorption. A week passed. At the elder's residence, everyone was beginning to doubt Chris's survival. The old master wondered if the boy was still alive after so long missing. Marion reflected on whether he had really been so greedy that he lost himself trying to absorb everything. Simon reported that even Viscount Langham, the acting director, agreed that Chris was probably already dead. He had already expressed his desire to close the path to the sacred ground soon and was ready to give the final order. The elder, irritated, cursed the boy for testing his patience. He then asked Simon if he believed the child was still alive. He said that if Simon confirmed his death, he would immediately order the path closed. But Simon, with a slight smile, replied that the child was truly interesting. The elder sighed and declared that he would allow only one more day. If Chris did not return by then, the path would be sealed forever. Marion was visibly nervous. Meanwhile, Simon simply replied respectfully that he would do as the elder wished. Meanwhile, Chris was still immersed in darkness. His draconic heart absorbed so much magical energy that it ended up breaking. At that critical moment, Mefina reached out her hand and asked him to hold on before it was too late. However, Chris refused to accept the help. Mefina grew irritated and said he was a fool, as he should know that anyone who was not a demon was not welcome in that shadowy realm. But instead of backing down, Chris stood firm. He knew that place was the realm of concepts, a space where ordinary laws did not apply. So he did something so extraordinary that even Mefina could barely believe what she was seeing. Amid a blinding light, Chris's body underwent a drastic transformation. His eyes turned red, horns emerged on his head, and he entered a state of demonization. Demonization was a secret technique from the mystical clan of black magic. It was a forbidden magic that allowed a mortal to temporarily transform into a demon, gaining explosive power. However, the process was extremely dangerous and could be fatal to its user. In the past, even Rina had died after attempting this technique. But Chris did not follow the usual path. He eliminated all auxiliary amplification enchantments and, within the conceptual space, created a mana vessel without any penalty. With this unprecedented structure, he was able to withstand over 90% of the sacred darkness entering his body. Mefina watched the unbelievable scene in astonishment. Before her, the crescent black moon appeared, symbolizing Chris's success. She asked, shocked, how a mere mortal, a simple insect, dared to heal his flesh in such a way. She could not understand how he had done it. Chris, on the other hand, simply asked if she truly did not know who he was. He introduced himself as a genius and said he was leaving. If she wanted to stay there, so be it. As he walked away, he stretched his arm back and showed Mefina the middle finger, provoking her. Surprisingly, she only laughed at the gesture. Chris wondered whether she really believed he was crazy enough to want to see her again. To him, she was an extremely annoying woman. Not knowing how much time had passed in that place, Chris speculated that perhaps a week had already gone by. If that were true, chaos had probably broken out in the main residence. With that thought, he dispelled his demonization and wondered if he could play a prank before reappearing. At that moment, a messenger arrived and announced that young Master Christian had returned. Everyone at the table questioned whether he was truly alive. Among them was Langham of Baron, the current leader of the Black Magic clan. The messenger reported that the young master had barely survived and was in a state of extreme fatigue. The healer confirmed that she felt black magic inside him, but it was deeply obscured. She stated that Chris would probably have trouble using magic magic properly from then on. The news shocked everyone. Many said that someone like him could never absorb even 80% of the sacred black magic. To them, Chris had been a victim of his own greed. Some even suggested he should be held responsible for it. However, Langham asked everyone to leave. He said the matter could be discussed another time. Alone with his subordinate, Langham asked Macfield if all of it was really true. Macfield, who had stayed close to the healer, confirmed that Chris's core had been affected. Langham became restless and began tapping his finger, a gesture that also made Macfield nervous. Then Langham mentioned Loin, saying he should become the sacrifice in the next plan of the venomous mage. The failure of the plan to get rid of Jupian and Loan concerned him, especially because the father seemed to be showing interest in that boy. Langham said that only a small stain remained to be removed from the family's waters, and for that reason, ordered that Christian be brought before him the next morning. He would decide the boy's fate together with the other clan leaders. The next morning, Chris was taken before the clan elders. He knew that everyone there wanted him out of the way. Gathering so many important figures at once was a clear sign of judgment. Langham began the meeting by asking if Christian was aware of the sins he committed during the sacred black rite. Chris replied that yes, he was aware. Langham then asked him to state exactly what those sins were. Chris replied that his peers were not worthy of the Black Magic clan's bloodline, and that his only sin was not having hit them hard enough. One of the members stood up in anger, but Langham ordered him to sit down. Langham went on to explain that Chris's true mistake was monopolizing a precious clan resource and still failing to produce a result worthy of that privilege. When Chris asked what the appropriate measure of performance would be, Langham stated that the minimum acceptable was a purity of 70%. Chris then wanted to know what the punishment would be for not having absorbed at least that percentage of sacred black energy. Langham declared that Chris would not inherit any black magic techniques, would be permanently banned from entering the main house grounds, and would also be denied succession in the house of Count Khazar. However, Chris asked how exactly his results were being evaluated, since it seemed that no one there actually knew what percentage of the sacred black energy he had absorbed. It was then that Chris's older brother raised his hand and asked to speak. He suggested a method to measure the purity of Chris's energy, stating that although his core was unstable, a black energy clash should be enough to provide a reliable comparison. The brother himself had absorbed 70% of the sacred energy. Therefore, if Chris could surpass him, it would indicate that he had exceeded that mark. At that moment, everyone was told what the so-called black energy clash was. It was a duel technique where both sides released exactly the same amount of energy. The one with the higher purity and black energy would completely overpower the opponent. When energies of similar levels clashed, the one with the greater concentration would win instantly. However, this type of clash put the mana cores of both parties at risk, potentially destroying them. Chris realized that his brother was more cold and calculating than he seemed, but showed himself ready for the challenge. He accepted the proposal and declared that if he achieved a result recognized by all, he wanted something in return: the clan leader's support to take the succession test and become a young master. Chris's brother agreed to the terms. To him, it did not matter whether the candidate was from the main bloodline or a branch. Everyone had the right to seek that title. That was the philosophy of the Magic Empire, that the strong should surpass the weak. But as a precaution, his brother warned that during the black energy clash, Chris should control his power well. To avoid seriously injuring him, he would use only 2-star level black energy. However, he warned that there would be a notable difference in purity. When the clash began, still mildly, Chris commented that his brother didn't need to act so carefully, and that he should worry about his own core. Hearing this, his brother became even more curious about Chris's current power level. At the beginning of the confrontation, his energy completely swallowed Chris's, but only for an instant. Chris reacted immediately and dissipated the energy as if it were insignificant, nullifying it in the blink of an eye. In response, his brother increased the strength of his energy even more and launched it again at Chris, but once again Chris absorbed it with ease. Then Chris expressed disappointment. He said his brother seemed to think he was all-powerful, but in practice, he didn't have that much strength. Irritated, the young master decided to use 4-star level black energy. Some people warned that at that pace, Chris's core might be destroyed. However, when the energy was released, it was completely absorbed by him. Chris then reminded his brother that he was the one who had warned to be careful with the impact. He said that, at that moment, his brother was the one who should be worried. As soon as his energy struck the young master, he coughed up blood. The blow was so intense that it nearly destroyed his mana core. Even disoriented, Chris's brother admitted that he had reached at least 90% purity. Everyone present was shocked by the result. Chris then asked if he now had the right to take the test to become a young master. Langham, clearly irritated and dissatisfied, said that a promise was a promise and that he would allow him to take the test. However, he emphasized that never before had a member of a branch family taken that exam. As the leader of the clan, he himself would randomly select which trial would be applied to Chris. Chris understood that this was merely an attempt to make his approval more difficult. The leader would likely choose an impossible trial. Still, Langham continued explaining that the evaluation would occur in 2 phases. First, Chris would have to prove his talent. Then, he would have to achieve something that demonstrated he was worthy of the Young Master title. Chris asked how he should prove his talent, and the leader replied that he would have to reach the 3rd star in just 3 months. Hearing that, Chris said that for someone like him, it wouldn't be that hard. He declared that he was a genius and would accept the challenge. The leader simply replied that they would meet again in 3 months. Later, in a private conversation with Eshid, Langham said he was disappointed in him. Eshid admitted that he had underestimated Chris and because of that, had his core damaged. They would have to act quickly to avoid more serious consequences. Langham, however, said that was not a cause for concern. He stated that Eshid knew as well as he did why one should avoid absorbing more than 70% of the sacred energy. He explained that the higher the absorbed purity, the harder it was to raise the level of black energy. In fact, reaching the 3rd star with such purity was exponentially more difficult. In his view, it would be completely impossible for Chris to achieve that in just 3 months. Confident, Langham concluded that no matter how much of a genius the boy was, he would never surpass that barrier. Meanwhile, later on, Marie was serving a delicious meal to Chris, commenting that his feats had already spread throughout the mansion. Marie said that with the charisma Chris showed, he would be able to win the hearts of all the young girls in the mansion. He became visibly embarrassed and asked her to stop, saying it was too awkward. But Marie continued and revealed that, during the time she was waiting for Chris's return, she ended up discovering her true feelings for him. She said that every day without news felt like an eternity of suffering. Her words made Chris remember something very specific. He recalled his old group and the time he spent with them. In that memory, they asked if he was okay. One of the girls commented that someone as agile as him couldn't possibly be seriously hurt. Another member said they would check for themselves, and all Chris had to do was get up. Another girl remarked that she didn't know Rania was so worried about him, but Rania replied that it wasn't her who was worried. It was Evan, who became confused upon hearing that. Chris thought it had been a long time since he last felt something so warm. Ever since he escaped that infernal clan that only wanted his destruction, his life had been filled with blood, death, and suffering. But when he met those kind-hearted people in that old group, he had a brief chance to live something different. Now, he felt something similar regarding Marie. With that in mind, Chris finally said the words he had never had the courage to say in his previous life. He sincerely thanked Marie for everything she had done for him. She blushed deeply and asked if he was finally returning her feelings. She said her heart was beating too fast, but he replied that she didn't even have a heart. Then Marie said that was because Chris had stolen hers. Chris smiled and said that, in recognition of her efforts, he would give her a reward. He suggested going out together. Marie became extremely excited, asking repeatedly if it was true, and he replied that yes, it was, and asked her to calm down. They went out for a walk, something Marie had always wanted to do. She was overjoyed to see the outside world again. Chris thought that, even with all his responsibilities, it was good to relax from time to time. However, he knew he still needed to reach the 3rd star in just 3 months. That would be an enormous challenge, especially dealing with sacred black energy at 90% purity. Moreover, he would still have to face resistance from the main family's tutors. As he walked through the garden, he was approached by his aunt, who commented that he seemed to be thinking about how to solve his problems. She asked if he had already found a master to train him. Chris replied, suggesting that maybe she could train him herself, but the aunt declined. She said that although she wasn't the right person, she could take him to someone who truly was. Chris thanked her for the gesture and said goodbye to Marie, promising to see her later. She understood and accepted with a smile. The aunt then led him into the mansion, and Chris confessed that he didn't know who she had in mind, but he was deeply grateful that she cared about him. The aunt explained that it wasn't something he needed to thank her for just yet, because he would only understand after experiencing it for himself. She said that no one had ever been able to endure that person's lessons, but that this was a unique opportunity that wouldn't come again. Therefore, he needed to work hard not to disappoint him. Later, they came across a child who seemed lost. Chris approached and asked where the child's parents were. However, the child remained silent. That was when his aunt scolded him, asking him to show respect, because that child was actually the incarnation of the former leader of the clan. Chris respectfully introduced himself, and the leader was impressed by the purity of the black energy he possessed, stating that it reached 90% or perhaps even a little more. Chris thanked him for the compliment, but the elder warned him that he had made a very irresponsible decision. Chris acknowledged it and said he had chosen to take the risk. The elder explained that by absorbing more than 80% purity, Chris would face challenges immensely greater than others. He stated that not even the progenitor of the family had reached that level without the blessing of His Majesty, the Demon Emperor. The elder then suggested that if he wanted, he could remove part of the energy's purity and return it to the spiritual world. With 80% purity, Chris would still have enough capacity to evolve. However, before he could continue, Chris interrupted him with a question. He wanted to know why the elder thought the black magic clan clan had weakened so much in recent times. His aunt was surprised by the question and asked him to explain. Chris then said that although the clan was not on the same level as the mystical magic clan or the undead magic clan, even among the 12 so-called divine new clans, the black magic clan was considered the weakest. The elder asked if Chris believed there was a reason for that, and he confirmed. He said black magic had thrived for many generations thanks to the elder's accomplishments, but today the world saw the black magic clan as decadent. Chris stated that the reason was clear: the lack of quality among individuals in the absolute stage, those above 8 stars of power. In his view, when the Demon King of Carnage attacked the black magic clan, Nordian would already be dead. There would be no one else with 7 or 8 stars to face him. Everyone in the clan would try to resist, but in the end, they would be killed or turned into slaves. This, according to Chris, showed how essential the most powerful members of the clan were, those above 8 stars. Chris knew the elder was worried about him. After all, the purity of the black energy he carried could crush him if he wasn't careful. Even so, he didn't believe that his fate was limited to simply strengthening the clan. He wanted to go beyond those challenges and prove that he could become a being of unlimited power. The elder listened to his bold words and, impressed, simply said he hoped Chris would not regret what he had just said. Then, without further explanation, the elder opened a black hole and pulled Chris into it. In the next moment, Chris found himself in the middle of a forest. That was the beginning of his first task to inherit pure black energy. He had to survive in that place on his own. Soon, a two-headed bear appeared before him, making it clear that the danger was real. Meanwhile, outside, the elder and Marion, his aunt, were watching everything closely. She commented that throwing a child in the 2nd star stage into the territory of a 4th star monster was extremely dangerous. The elder disagreed, saying that it still wasn't enough. To increase the challenge, the elder also summoned a stone lizard, equally powerful. Marion immediately regretted having said anything, realizing that she had only worsened her nephew's situation. The elder explained that the more Chris fought to survive, the faster and deeper he would understand the essence of pure black energy. According to him, it is at the brink of death that such understanding truly reveals itself. Even so, he commented that he hoped the boy wouldn't get too hurt. Marion then showed a box full of sweets. It was something she had prepared at the elder's request, who began eating them cheerfully without any formality. He even joked that he was ignoring any risk of diabetes and that he didn't know why, but whenever he used black energy, he felt an immense craving for sweets. Soon after, he snapped his fingers and turned off the lights in the room, saying that watching the trial in the dark would be much better. Meanwhile, Chris stood face to face with the two monsters. He knew that if he were hit even once, all his bones would be broken. The lizard even spat venom in his direction, which scared him even more. He thought that a single mistake would cost him his life. Still, he tried to calm himself, reminding himself that this was just training. In theory, he couldn't actually die there. Even so, despair set in. He tried asking the elder something, but received no response. Using telepathy, Marion informed him that he would not receive any help. If he wanted to leave, he would have to find a way to defeat those monsters on his own. Chris then accepted the situation. He told himself he would find a way, no matter how hard it was. When the two-headed bear attacked for the first time, he managed to dodge. He knew the creature was extremely strong and fast, but he also knew there was a way to counterattack. The elder watched closely and commented that Chris really had talent. His movements were different from the others. Marion agreed, although she reminded him that Chris was still just a child. But just seconds later, the boy had already taken down the two-headed bear, surprising them both. They were shocked by it, and Marion asked how he had managed to do it. Chris explained that he knew the creature's weaknesses. Although it had immense physical strength and high defense, its agility and magical resistance were extremely low. He took advantage of that, created an opening, and injected black magic directly into the bear's heart, defeating it quickly. Marion then asked the elder if what she was thinking was true. It was Simon who appeared to answer, saying that the technique Chris used was called Black Death, a skill that the elder himself had frequently used in his youth. But Chris hadn't won completely yet. The stone lizard was still before him, and he had almost forgotten about the second enemy. The creature tried to bite him, but the boy dodged swiftly, also avoiding the venom jet that followed. He knew that monster had 3 stone hearts, and as long as they were intact, it would not truly die. So he took a different approach. He created black magic threads and wrapped them around the lizard's body. With the generated pressure, he managed to crush the creature's hearts one by one, then tore its body into pieces, preventing its regeneration. Simon, with his face pressed against the crystal ball, praised the technique. He said it was an excellent application of Black Death. The elder, a bit annoyed, asked him to move away from the view, commenting that an invisible vampire was even more troublesome than a mirror. When he asked if Marion had taught that to Chris, she replied that she hadn't. Somehow he had learned it on his own. Simon remarked that, at that level, maybe he no longer needed instructors. The elder decided that was enough. Chris had passed the test. The boy was then pulled back through the same black hole he had entered, reappearing at the starting point. The elder said he had done much better than expected. Chris replied that it was an excellent test, and that it served well to test the real applications of pure dark magic. The elder, however, warned him not to boast. He said that now the true learning of dark magic would begin. He then ordered Simon and Marion to leave the room, and Marion, concerned, closed the door with regret, feeling sorry for Chris. The elder was preparing to give the first lesson. He asked if the boy knew what dark magic was. Chris guessed it was absolute control over the opponent. The elder asked what absolute meant, but Chris didn't know how to answer. Without further words, the elder told him to just watch. Then he broke the seal of the place and released all the darkness inside. He said that by descending the stairs, 12 abysses would await him. He called upon an ancient raven that sought wisdom, asking it to embrace all that darkness and completely cover the master in shadows. Next, the elder wielded a blade made of pure darkness and made a cut that sliced not only through Chris's neck, but also through reality itself. Dazed, the boy barely had time to react and wondered, confused, what had just happened. Chris felt something lightly pass by his neck, but he was still alive. The elder explained that it was a conceptual blade, created entirely from dark magic. It only cut what the user intended to cut. After demonstrating the technique, the elder gave Chris 1 month to create the exact same black blade, which left him completely shocked. He had no idea how he would do that. Alone, Chris began training his body with dedication. He ran, did push-ups, and although he looked a bit more muscular, he felt he still needed to grow more. So he went back to focusing on his magical training. Time passed, and he kept trying to manifest the black blade. Sometimes it appeared, but it vanished after a few seconds. He knew it wasn't easy. When he finally managed to summon his own black blade, it disappeared after 10 seconds. And even that version was still very different from the one the elder had demonstrated. The blade shown by the elder was made of pure original darkness. To reach that level, Chris thought he would have to descend into the 12 abysses and absorb the knowledge of the great god of darkness. He began reflecting on the enigmatic incantation the elder had revealed and suspected there was a hidden secret in his words. A month passed. The elder returned accompanied by Marion. He believed that after all that time, Chris would have already learned his own limits. Marion, on the other hand, remained silent, visibly worried. The elder asked why she was so distressed about that boy. She asked if that method was really the fastest, reminding him that Chris had an important test in 2 months. The elder replied that, with the absurd purity of the dark energy that boy inherited, quick progress was impossible. Forcing growth would be like hitting a wall. The most important thing was building a solid foundation, something more valuable than any test. When they arrived, the elder was completely surprised. Chris was already waiting for them, holding his own black blade. Marion and the elder were speechless. Chris thanked them for the teachings. He said that thanks to the elder's guidance, he managed to reach the 3rd star much faster than he had expected. He then dismissed the blade and explained that, for now, it was still just an imitation. He said it took about a week to manifest the first blade, but he soon realized that was only the surface of the true challenge. Chris kept reflecting on the mysterious incantation. He asked if the 12 abysses meant it was necessary to imbue the 12 magical attributes simultaneously when creating the black blade. The elder began to sweat. He realized that the boy had not only managed to create the blade, but had also uncovered the secret behind the riddle. Creating a basic black blade usually took at least a year. Understanding the 12 magics to awaken the true blade could take a lifetime. And yet, Chris had done it all in just 1 month. The elder wondered if that boy might actually be the glimpse of hope needed to reach the end of forbidden magic. For the first time, he smiled genuinely and told Chris to prepare himself. Starting the next day, the real teaching would begin, and it would be anything but easy. Chris was overjoyed. He said he trusted him and that he had finally succeeded. He wondered how he should celebrate that victory. Later, Chris was in the mansion's cellar, surrounded by expensive drinks. He grabbed a liquor so refined he had never dreamed of tasting it. He said it was his lucky day and hoped Marie wouldn't see him doing that. But he was soon interrupted by a voice. Someone scolded him for drinking in the middle of the day. Sensing the energy, he deduced it was a 3rd star mage. Noting the color of her eyes, he realized she wasn't using dark magic. Chris tried to guess who she was, but his question was met with a slap across the face. One of the servants stepped in, asking her not to worry about trash like him. Another servant tried to take the liquor from Chris's hands, and he, confused, asked what was going on. The servant explained that the woman was Princess Marisa, a mage of extreme poison. Chris was surprised. He asked if that meant she was his fiancée. The butler corrected him, saying that More precisely, she was his ex-fiancée. He sighed, realizing the situation had just gotten much more complicated. As she walked away, Marisa was overtaken by memories from when she was only 8 years old. She had been bored, her brother had gone to speak with the elders, and she wondered why, as a mage of extreme poison, she had to be part of all that. She remembered hearing the elders insult her father, Duke Huam, saying that his son was useless and that at least he had arranged a daughter so his son-in-law would be good for something. Those cruel words echoed in her mind until that day she crossed paths with Chris for the first time. He found her alone and asked what she was doing there. Marisa, proud, replied that she wasn't just any child, she was Marisa. Chris introduced himself and said he didn't care what the elders said because everything would be settled in the future with a fair revenge. Marisa declared that she too would have her revenge. She said she would become the greatest demonic practitioner of all and make the elders swallow every single one of those words. Chris liked her ambition and said that it suited the lineage of extreme poison. He stated that he believed she would become the best, which was why he wanted to stay by her side. He called her the future greatest practitioner of demonic energy and asked if she would like a guide to show her around the territory. Embarrassed, Marisa accepted. Now, remembering all of that, she shook her head vehemently in denial. She thought it was all in the past, even if the engagement had been arranged for the sake of peace between the houses. For a long time, she had dreamed of a future they could share, but everything was destroyed. In her view, that idiot had ruined it all. Continuing on her way, Marisa headed to a meeting with Langham. She commented that it had been a long time since she last saw Marquet. She explained that a treasure had been discovered in the neutral zone between the two houses, and Langham asked what the Extreme Poison Clan planned to do about it. The Extreme Poison Clan had already secured the last relic and now wanted to obtain the next one as well. However, there was a risk that it would be handed over to the Dark Magic Clan. Marisa made it clear that this would not happen. According to her, if the roles were reversed, they would do the same. She would not allow the relic to be given away so easily. Langham asked if she wanted to create a fair competition for the relic, and Marisa confirmed. Each house would send its own expedition team, and whoever found the relic first would keep it. To avoid open conflict, Marisa proposed that each team be limited to 10 participants of up to 3 stars, preventing the deployment of more powerful mages and avoiding direct combat. She also warned that if too much blood was spilled, external enemies could benefit, especially considering the unstable political climate since the appearance of the so-called Four Kings star. Langham agreed to the terms, but it seemed suspicious. She knew Langham was not easy to deal with, and it didn't take long for him to add an extra condition. He stated that if the extreme poison mages broke the agreement, not only would the current relic go to the Dark Magic Clan, but so would the one they had recently obtained. Marisa, surprised, asked what he meant by breaking the agreement. Langham explained that underhanded tactics like sabotage or ambushes would be considered violations, as such practices were typical of the extreme poison mages. Marisa assured him that this would not happen and accepted the condition. When Langham asked if she would lead the expedition herself, Marisa confirmed that was the plan. He replied that he looked forward to witnessing the power of the 10,000 lesser poisons, making it clear he would be watching closely. The meeting ended with the promise that they would meet again on the day of the expedition. Once alone, Langham moved pieces on his chessboard, visualizing the next steps. He planned to bring them down one by one. To him, it was all part of a perfect scenario, and the Dark Magic Clan would be the greatest beneficiary. 2 months passed. The seasons changed, and while Chris completed his training, other paths also began to shift. Old feelings, past grudges, and repressed ambitions began to stir conflict. Those who had lost their chances sharpened their blades, and those blinded by envy prepared to act. Some were willing to do anything to change their fate. Finally, the day came when Chris would have to prove his worth as the young master. Before Langham and the other elders, he summoned his black blade, revealing all his power. Eshid's reaction was immediate. His expression was pure irritation, which amused Chris. He thought that seeing that face was priceless. The elder had warned him not to show the black blade in front of Langham, as it would only bring an even harder challenge. But Chris ignored the warning. He believed he had to do what he thought was right and wanted to see the reaction of those who had underestimated him. Langham, surprised by what he saw, acknowledged Chris's power, but announced that there would be a second test. He informed them that an expedition unit would be sent to recover a relic in a neutral zone, and that the extreme poison mages would also participate in the mission. If Chris performed well, Langham would recognize him as the rightful heir. Chris thought it it all sounded too easy and asked if he would have to do it alone. Langham replied no. He would join a pre-established team led by Dill. That mission had originally been assigned to Loin, and Chris should consider it an honor. As he left, Chris promised to remember those words. Eshid, uncomfortable, commented to his father that he feared Chris would gain even more recognition with this mission. Langham, however, told him not to worry. Everything was going according to plan. Eshid just needed to be ready for the right moment. While reflecting on the mission, Chris found it odd that he hadn't been given something more dangerous. Everything seemed too easy. He began to suspect something was wrong. That's when he remembered the original timeline. In that version, it was Loin who became the next heir, not Chris. However, he couldn't remember what had happened to Loin during the war. The memory came from his past life, from a moment when he was brushing the hair of a girl from his former group, the one who transformed into a fox. She had mentioned an incident involving a cursed amulet, a relic that caused a conflict between the Dark Magic clan and the Extreme Poison clan. It was an event unknown to the outside world because both clans had decided never to speak of it again. The Dark Magic clan was completely destroyed during that expedition, and the Extreme Poison mages also suffered irreparable losses. Even so, both sides buried the incident. However, for Chris, what truly mattered was that this incident had been the seed of an even greater catastrophe. Nordian was killed, and the one responsible was his own son, Langham. Chris, now in the present, thought that if that event had never happened, the Blood Monarch wouldn't have conquered the Dark Magic clan so easily. The cursed amulet incident marked the beginning of the era of destruction for the Dark Magic clan. The entire unit from the clan was completely annihilated. In other words, this time, instead of Loin dying, he would become the one responsible for the downfall. It wasn't just a simple test. It was a carefully crafted scheme by Langham, and acting without evidence would be extremely dangerous. At that moment, Chris was only a 3-star mage and still didn't fully understand the extent of his power. That's why he decided he needed to prepare, and the first step was to get out of there as quickly as possible. However, as he tried to leave, Jupien appeared in his path, arrogantly asking where he thought he was going. Chris, without patience, replied that it was none of her business. Jupien, who had already heard about his inclusion in the expedition team, became even more irritated. She wasn't happy about the situation, especially since he was taking over Loin's role, someone she deeply respected. Even so, Chris just asked if she was planning to do anything about it, saying he doubted Loin even cared about what was happening. The provocation enraged Jupien. She threw the knife she was holding so hard that the blade struck a stone, leaving a crater. But Chris didn't even flinch. He knew she had thrown the knife on purpose to miss, and realized she was only trying to intimidate him. After the brief clash, he said he was satisfied with their greetings, and didn't intend to see her again until the expedition. He wished her good luck and walked away. Watching him go, Jupien realized he had calculated the knife's trajectory precisely and hadn't dodged out of pure confidence. That made her understand that Chris was far more dangerous than she had imagined. Later, in the outer market of the Dark Magic family, Chris decided to relax. He had a few drinks, gambled a bit, and bought food. He was pleased to eat quality meat again, something he hadn't done in a long time. If it were up to him, he would have preferred that peaceful kind of life. But while walking through the streets, he noticed he was near a certain merchant's shop and immediately sensed that he was being followed. He suspected the pursuers were Langham's subordinates and considered confronting them on the spot. Before he could act, he was pulled into an alley by a hooded woman. She warned him that people were after him, but assured him her own subordinates were already taking care of it. Despite the warning, Chris didn't trust her. After all, who would trust someone who dragged them into a dark, deserted alley? When he asked who she was, the woman simply replied that she was someone trying to prevent strange signs from spreading throughout the castle of the evil king. She said they should move to a more isolated place, and Chris followed cautiously. As they entered an even more secluded alley, Chris asked how far they were going. The woman then began to explain that recently, people connected to the castle had started disappearing without a trace. The safety zones were being destroyed one by one. As everyone knew, the evil king's territory was marked by constant conflict, a place ruled by fear. The family heads there didn't care about anyone's life or death. That was why she had decided to act on her own and try to help communities and families eliminate the criminal forces in the area. However, she couldn't ask for help without offering something in return. She promised to give Chris information about the storm soon to fall upon the Dark Magic family. She said that Langham was in collusion with a powerful figure from the Extreme Poison family, and that together they planned to kill Marissa, daughter of that family. Chris was surprised to learn that the goal wasn't just to destroy destroy the family, but also to assassinate Marisa. He asked what the motive behind it was. The hooded woman explained that if the two families lost balance, the leaders of the evil king's castle would become more active. This would collapse the fragile equilibrium among the 12 families and cause a tragedy of even greater proportions. That's why she hoped Chris was prepared for the mission to explore the relic. More than that, she hoped he would become the young master of the family and prevent the collapse. Reflecting on all of that, Chris realized the woman seemed to know too much. It was clear that she had a solid network of information. Still, he couldn't trust her blindly. He asked what she had to offer in exchange for cooperation. If she wanted to work with him, she needed to put something at stake too. The woman grew nervous at his demand, but then revealed something that deeply shocked Chris. Later, the agreement between them was sealed. As the hooded woman walked away, something stirred in the shadows behind her. A dark entity spoke to her, asking why she still hadn't revealed her true identity to Chris. The woman replied that it was better this way. If he ended up in danger and mentioned her name, the consequences could be severe. For now, everything would remain a secret. That woman was, in fact, Idrine. Meanwhile, Chris was excited. He had received a VIP card for the Shadow Auction House, a secret market that dealt in smuggled relics and rare creatures. This type of card was only granted to verified nobles or extremely wealthy individuals. In his past life, he had never gained access to anything like that. The card he received had been signed by Leah de Bolfman, a name he had never heard before, which reminded him of Idrine's words. Even so, it was still too soon to fully trust her. For now, Chris decided to simply continue his preparations. After everything, Chris decided to send a message by owl. That was the first step. Now, he needed to meet a certain person. Later, he arrived at an extremely luxurious location. The grand facade and heavily guarded surroundings made it clear that this was not a place for just anyone. When he tried to enter, one of the guards looked at him with disdain and said it wasn't a place for children. But Chris, with a serious face and confident posture, showed his card. It wasn't just a VIP card, it was a VVIP card, one of the most exclusive that existed. The guard was completely stunned. He didn't question anything further and immediately authorized his entry. As soon as he passed through the doors, Chris found himself in a dazzling hall. It was a luxurious masquerade ball, with refined lighting, soft music, and guests dressed in extravagant clothing. A butler approached and politely asked if he was Leah de Bolfman. Chris calmly replied that he was, and asked if there was any problem. That would be his identity for the night. The butler said there was no problem at all, but inside, he thought something wasn't right. The voice was clearly masculine. Still, since the order had been given, the butler accepted without question. Chris then asked to be guided to the branch manager, as he wanted to speak with him personally. Later, Chris waited in the reception room, observing every detail around him. Everything there was of the highest quality, just as one would expect from the prestigious Rudolph Mercantile Group. This group was massive and had strong connections with the Circus Mercantile Group, although its true expansion had occurred through the black market. They completely dominated the distribution routes to the black magic empire. It was said that if the Rudolph Group got its hands on something, no one else could compete. The branch manager finally appeared and apologized for the delay. He introduced himself as Ruvid, the one in charge of that branch and the auction house. He asked if there was anything Chris needed. Calmly removing the mask he wore, Chris gave only one response. He wanted them to bring Ruina. Ruvid looked confused and asked if he really knew what he was asking for. He questioned if Ruina wasn't the leader of the Mercantile Guild, and even if she was, how could he simply bring her there? But Chris said that wasn't quite it. He explained that Ruina was already there. She was hiding, perhaps using some kind of artifact, but he could see her clearly. The manager began protesting, trying to deny everything, but Chris interrupted, saying he already knew the truth. It was just a disguise. Ruvid was actually Ruina in disguise, and he knew it. Ruina, realizing she had been discovered, asked how he knew. Chris smiled discreetly, remembering how he had suffered at her hands in his past life. Of course, back then, he had taken revenge with even greater intensity afterward. Chris remarked that for someone as important as her, she was using a very poor camouflage relic. The effect was weak and the disguise clumsy. Ruina was surprised and said it couldn't be possible that he was Chris. He in turn thought it was natural for her to doubt. He joked that maybe her face was too big and the mask couldn't cover it all. Ruina replied that she didn't think that was the reason, but even so, said he wasn't Leah de Bolfman, nor anyone known in the Black Magic Empire. She said he was talking too much for someone who had just arrived. After all, he was using someone else's name to enter a commercial place exclusive to members. He had no right to criticize anyone, but Chris, unfazed, asked who exactly was threatening whom. He asked if she wanted him to spread rumors that she, Ruina, was involved with the syndicate that did illegal business with the Black Magic Empire. Ruina was visibly nervous upon realizing that Chris knew too much. She immediately wanted to know what he wanted in exchange for keeping it secret. Later, he left the place loaded with rare items. He was practically overflowing with valuable things. It was obvious that Ruina was furious about it, but he had obtained all the ingredients he wanted. In the end, he was just trying to prevent a future destruction, something that would end up helping Ruina herself too, even if she didn't admit it. In truth, she should be thanking him. Although the items weren't enough to significantly increase Chris's power, they could help delay or even prevent part of Langham's plans. Perhaps with them, he could face one or two high-level enemies. When he returned home, Chris was immediately questioned by Zhu Pian, who wanted to know where he had been. Since he was back, she suggested he join the training. Chris, however, refused, saying he was tired and didn't see the point of training if he didn't intend to fight like a common soldier. He wished the others a good session and walked away. One of the members commented that he was useless, but Zhu Pian told them to leave him alone. She believed he wasn't even worth worrying about. Even so, she knew that if he didn't achieve something soon, he would fall behind in the competition for the throne. Or maybe deep down, he was just pretending to be a fool. Later, when meeting with Ruina again, or rather with her still disguised, the woman wanted to know what he planned to do with everything. Chris responded naturally that, to be honest, he had no idea. Even so, Ruina brought more items to him, saying he was a completely unrefined creature. She couldn't understand what he was scheming, but she asked if he would keep her identity secret. Chris assured her that he would, and suggested they continue meeting regularly. Ruina retorted that she never wanted to see his face again. Still, Chris asked if he could start calling her Ru from now on. Then he said that a war was about to break out. The Union and the Magic Empire were already on the move, and the political situation on the continent was becoming extremely serious. A widespread conflict seemed inevitable. With the continent's trade routes about to be blocked, one of the two sides would have to be eliminated. Both knew that if that happened, trade would be cut in half. Ruina thought the analysis was exaggerated and said war wasn't something that simple. But Chris, observing the rumors from the capital, said it wasn't an absurd idea. Ruina admitted that she had been investigating it over the past few days. The atmosphere in the imperial capital was truly terrible. Many noble houses had already declared themselves against the Magic Empire and planned to ally with the Union. In light of that, Ruina asked why he was telling her all this. What did he expect a mere merchant to do to stop a war? But Chris firmly replied that that was exactly what he expected. He wanted her to become his sponsor. He said he was going to create a new future and that this war was a gamble he had to win. He also mentioned that they would have to cross the Black Magic Kingdom in the south, where the family of dark mages lived. If he managed to become a duke in that region and prepared in advance, they could avoid the worst-case scenario. According to him, that was the only way to prevent Ruina's income from being cut in half. Then he asked if she was willing to accept the deal. Ruina became thoughtful. She analyzed Chris's gaze and realized he wasn't just bluffing. Maybe it really was a good investment. In the end, she agreed to the deal. Ruina made it clear that if he broke his word even once, she would crush him personally. Chris accepted without protest, saying he didn't like repeating his promises either. As he said goodbye, he even made a joke by calling her Miss Moneybag and wished her a safe return. Later, Chris began using the rare ingredients he had obtained at the auction. Knowing that the Extreme Poison family would be involved in the expedition to the relic, he decided to prepare antidotes, just as a precaution. He remarked that it had been a long time since he'd last worked on that, and wasn't even sure it would work. As he worked, memories from his past life resurfaced. At that time, he had been trained within the renowned medicine clan under the guidance of a master specialized in antidotes. He remembered her voice telling him that the flame was too low and that he needed to blow harder. That woman was Elra, the second-generation leader of the clan, an undisputed authority in the art of antidotes. Elra had once said that the clan had no trouble controlling fire. Meanwhile, Chris recalled the first time he met her, on the battlefield during the First War. She had been forced to go to war at a very young age because the demon king of evil blood had exterminated her clan, the renowned medicine clan. This clan was the most esteemed among the 7 great allied clans, known for its superior medical skills, and thus became an obstacle to the demon king. She had not escaped the destruction unscathed, having been gravely wounded by the enemy's sword. After recalling that, Chris continued his learning process to produce an ancient remedy. Elra then remarked that, no matter how much she looked at him, Chris was truly a fascinating individual. It was impressive to think that he was managing to create both a medicine and an antidote using only a brief summary and a few explanations given by the leader of the Magic Clan. Chris noted that, even so, the leader of that prestigious clan was lying there, coughing up blood. But Elra replied that the very fact she was still breathing after being struck in the chest by the demon king of evil blood was already a miracle. It had only been possible thanks to the medicine Chris had created. She said she couldn't just walk away in her condition, as there were countless people in the world who would suffer the same pain she had, or worse. What had happened to her clan was tragic. Chris, however, said that nothing was more useless than dwelling on the past. She needed to focus on recovering. Then Elra decided to show him something specific, a book that contained the secrets of the renowned medicine clan. That book had saved her during the war. She didn't want him to refuse it. However, before she could finish giving it to him, she had another crisis and started coughing up blood again. With difficulty, she asked him to save those who were suffering. Only then could she close her eyes in peace. She told him he had to accept the book. Chris asked if he could finally call her master. Elra smiled and said that, considering she had barely taught him anything, it seemed like the disciple had chosen his master instead. From that moment on, Chris became the next leader of the renowned medicine clan, its true heir. He reflected that even though he had only studied part of the book, its contents didn't fully convey the clan's secret philosophies. But he decided to honor his promise and went to the battlefield to save those who had suffered from the war. Because of that, he came to be known as the Saint of the Battlefield. In the present, Chris thought to himself that his master was surely living well now in peace. He promised that, in this life, he would keep the vow he made to her. Then he sent a message via an owl. The bird flew to Khazar, his father. Upon receiving the owl, Khazar smiled and commented that his son had finally sent a message. However, upon reading it, he realized it was something extremely serious. With a determined expression, he declared that it was time for them to act. They needed to prepare for what was coming.